Sayers paradox. Imagine trying to solve a problem using the most advanced tools and knowledge available, only to find that the solution complicates the issue further instead of resolving it. This is the essence of Sayers paradox, the idea that greater knowledge and certainty can sometimes lead to increased complexity and unintended consequences. The paradox, named after philosopher Sayers, challenges the assumption that more information always leads to better decision-making or clearer answers. In fact, in many situations, increasing one's knowledge or precision can make the problem more difficult to solve. Imagine a scientist with precise data but no practical way to apply it. How does that help anyone? Or a strategist with an abundance of information yet no clear path forward? Sayers' paradox highlights how the pursuit of certainty can paradoxically reduce the ability to act effectively. By over-focusing on knowledge and accuracy, we risk becoming paralyzed by overthinking, data overload, or analysis paralysis. Let's explore Sayers' paradox, where the more we strive for clarity and certainty, the more we might find ourselves stuck in complexity and uncertainty. Sayers' paradox was named after philosopher Sayers in the late 20th century, who noticed a curious pattern in decision-making and problem-solving. While science, engineering, and strategy often rely on knowledge to inform actions, Sayers observed that greater knowledge could sometimes complicate things, leading to indecision or confusion rather than providing clear solutions. His observations were rooted in the emerging information age, where new technologies allowed for the collection of vast amounts of data, but they also led to a rise in overwhelming complexity and paralysis by analysis. In Sayers' paradox, more precise data doesn't always lead to better outcomes. In fact, it can make it harder to navigate real-world challenges. This paradox became particularly relevant in the context of modern decision-making, where organizations, governments, and scientists are faced with increasing amounts of data, and the process of distilling actionable insights becomes more difficult. Sayers' paradox is not just a theoretical construct, but also a warning about how our tools and methods of acquiring knowledge can inadvertently obstruct progress. It speaks to the limits of rationality and how certainty in one area can lead to unexpected difficulties in another, creating a tension between knowledge and practicality. Sayers' paradox provides a thought-provoking challenge to the common belief that knowledge and certainty naturally lead to better decision-making and problem-solving. On the contrary, the paradox suggests that more knowledge, especially when it is precise, quantitative, or detailed, can sometimes increase complexity, uncertainty, and the difficulty of making decisions. Let's delve deeper into the factors that contribute to this paradox and how it affects decision-making, problem-solving, and practical application in various fields. 1. The paradox of information overload. A. Too much information. In the modern world, we live in a constant state of information overload. With the advent of the internet, artificial intelligence, and big data, we now have more information than we can possibly process. At first glance, this sounds like a good problem. After all, more data should lead to more accurate decisions, right? However, Sayers' paradox reveals that having too much information can actually impair decision-making rather than enhance it. The human brain is limited in its ability to process vast amounts of information at once. When presented with an overwhelming amount of data, individuals often experience cognitive overload. This can lead to paralysis by analysis, where the abundance of choices and information makes it difficult to make any decision at all. In the quest for certainty and accuracy, we may become overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation, causing us to hesitate, overthink, or even make poor decisions due to excessive details. In a practical sense, consider how modern businesses, governments, or scientists now rely on big data to inform their decisions. While these data sets can be incredibly precise, the sheer volume and complexity of the information can make it harder to discern the most important insights. For example, a company might collect mountains of data about consumer behavior, but the process of analyzing this data could become so time-consuming and complicated that the company may struggle to implement effective marketing strategies or product development. B. The curse of precision. As knowledge becomes more precise, the margin for error shrinks, and the complexity of using that knowledge effectively increases. The curse of precision is a related concept in Sayers' paradox, where the drive for exactness in data and decision-making may actually limit our ability to make practical, actionable choices. In some fields, striving for perfect accuracy can lead to diminishing returns. The effort to achieve more precise results may not provide significant improvements in real-world outcomes, but rather complicate things. For example, in scientific research, experiments are often designed to be highly precise, with every variable controlled and measurements taken to an exact degree. However, in real-world applications, this level of precision may be unnecessary and may hinder progress. Trying to fine-tune a theory or technology beyond what is practically useful can lead to long delays or the unintended consequences of overcomplicating simple solutions. 2. Analysis paralysis, the decision-making dilemma. A. The psychological burden of excessive data. One of the most significant effects of Sayers' paradox is the psychological impact of excessive information on decision-making. When we are faced with too many options or too much data, it becomes difficult to make a choice. This phenomenon is known as analysis paralysis, a state of indecision that occurs when an individual is overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information they need to process. Analysis paralysis is common in areas like business, where managers must evaluate numerous market trends, customer data, and competitor information. The drive to make the best possible decision often leads to overthinking, which delays action and prevents timely decision-making. In this case, certainty and the desire to optimize every decision can backfire by preventing any decision from being made at all. In a similar vein, scientific research can suffer from the same problem. Researchers might become so focused on refining their hypotheses or perfecting their experiments that they fail to make timely contributions to their field. Instead of focusing on useful approximations or good enough solutions, the desire for absolute precision may stifle progress. B. The uncertainty of perfect knowledge. Ironically, Sayers' paradox suggests that increasing knowledge doesn't necessarily reduce uncertainty. In many cases, the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. New discoveries and more refined data often raise more questions than they answer. This paradox is especially evident in science, where progress frequently leads to even deeper uncertainty. In fields like quantum mechanics, astrophysics, or neuroscience, greater knowledge about the micro or macro aspects of reality opens up a vast array of new, unanswered questions. In decision-making, this paradox can be paralyzing. The more we know about a situation, the more complicated it becomes to make a decision, as we are now confronted with a broader range of possibilities, risks, and uncertainties. For example, in healthcare, a physician may have access to advanced medical data and cutting-edge technologies, but the increasing number of potential treatment options and uncertainties about side effects may make it harder to choose the best course of action. 3. The trade-off between speed and accuracy. A. The speed of decision-making. One of the most important lessons of Sayers' paradox is that speed is often sacrificed for accuracy. In many situations, making a quick decision is necessary, especially in contexts where time is of the essence. In business, military strategy, and medicine, waiting for the most accurate data or the perfect solution can lead to lost opportunities or even catastrophic failure. In contrast, opting for good enough solutions or approximate knowledge can often lead to faster decision-making, which may be more beneficial in the long run. The need for certainty can often be a hindrance to action. By accepting some level of uncertainty or imprecision, we can often make timely decisions that lead to progress. B. Balancing precision with practicality. The trade-off between precision and practicality is central to understanding Sayers' paradox. It's not always the most accurate or precise knowledge that leads to the best outcome. It's the ability to apply knowledge effectively and efficiently. In many real-world situations, practical application and speed are far more valuable than striving for absolute certainty. In medicine, for example, doctors may not have access to perfect data about a patient's condition, but they still need to make decisions based on the information available. Quick, confident decisions can often save lives, even if they're not based on perfect information. This principle is echoed in business, where decisive action often leads to success, even if it's not backed by every possible data point. 4. Sayers' paradox in practice. Real-world examples. A. Business and entrepreneurship. In the business world, entrepreneurs face the same dilemma posed by Sayers' paradox. The more information they gather, the harder it becomes to make a clear decision. Entrepreneurs often operate in uncertainty, and while access to data can help inform decisions, it can also slow them down. Too much research or analysis can lead to inaction. Successful entrepreneurs often rely on gut instinct, quick decisions, and the willingness to move forward despite the unknowns. B. Scientific research and innovation. In the field of scientific research, overthinking can also stifle progress. Scientists may get caught up in perfecting their models or hypotheses, but that process can take years. Meanwhile, smaller-scale experiments or approximations may provide valuable insights more quickly. Breakthrough innovations often arise from being imperfect, testing hypotheses rapidly, and iterating based on results, rather than waiting for the perfect answer. C. Public policy and governance. Governments and policymakers often face Sayus paradox when crafting laws or responses to crises. While they have access to vast amounts of data and expert opinions, the need for speed and efficiency often requires quick decision-making. Too much analysis can delay important policy actions, especially in times of emergency, such as public health crises or national security issues. Paradox of analysis. Imagine trying to define a concept you already know well. If you succeed, it seems obvious. But if the definition fails to capture the essence of the concept, does it mean the concept itself is unknowable? This is the paradox of analysis, a challenge that arises when we attempt to provide a precise definition or analysis of a concept we already understand intuitively. The paradox suggests that when we attempt to analyze or define a familiar concept, we either end up with a circular definition that doesn't really explain anything, or we create a definition that fails to capture the true nature of the concept. For example, how can we define something like justice or beauty without making the definition itself sound obvious or incomplete? The paradox of analysis raises fundamental questions about how we convey meaning, knowledge, and understanding through language. If a concept is already clear to us, why do we struggle to define it clearly? The paradox calls into question the limits of language and the boundaries of human understanding. Let's explore the paradox of analysis, where knowledge, language, and definition collide, forcing us to reconsider how we capture the essence of the world around us. The paradox of analysis was first formally discussed by the philosopher Gottlob Frege in the 19th century, who explored issues surrounding the nature of meaning and conceptual analysis. Frege's work on logic and philosophy of language laid the foundation for much of modern analytic philosophy, and his ideas about meaning are still central to discussions of the paradox. According to Frege, when we analyze or define a concept, we face the risk of either offering a circular definition, where the concept is defined in terms of itself, or producing a definition that doesn't fully capture the concept's essence. Frege's work was later developed by Russell, Wittgenstein, and other philosophers of language, who continued to grapple with the relationship between language, meaning, and conceptual analysis. The paradox has since become an important issue in philosophy of language, epistemology, and metaphysics, particularly regarding how we understand abstract concepts like truth, justice, or knowledge. The paradox of analysis is often used to highlight the limitations of language in conveying meaning, especially in cases where the concepts being analyzed are preconceived or intuitive. Over the years, philosophers have debated whether conceptual analysis can ever truly capture the essence of a concept, or whether it's an exercise in semantic futility. The paradox raises significant questions about how we understand the world and communicate that understanding through language. The paradox of analysis challenges the idea that it is always possible to provide a clear, precise definition of a concept. The paradox points out that, in trying to define a concept we already understand intuitively, we either end up in a circular argument where the definition depends on the very concept we're trying to explain, or we fail to fully capture the complexity and depth of the concept in question. At its core, the paradox is concerned with the limits of language and conceptual clarity, asking whether it is ever truly possible to analyze a concept without undermining the knowledge we already possess about it. Description: the nature of analysis and definition A. Defining familiar concepts. When we think about concepts like justice, truth, or beauty, we usually feel we have a good intuitive grasp of what they mean. These are concepts we use regularly in conversation and thought, and yet when we attempt to define them precisely, we often encounter difficulty. The problem becomes clear when we attempt to define something familiar. In doing so, we can't help but make the definition sound vague or obvious. The problem lies in the relationship between the known and the unknown. When we already have an understanding of a concept, any attempt to analyze or define it seems to either fall back on the pre-existing knowledge, leading to a circular definition, or fail to adequately capture the essence of the concept. For example, how would we define justice without relying on terms like fairness, equality, or rights? terms which themselves require further definition. Similarly, when we attempt to define beauty, we find ourselves describing it in terms of things like harmony, symmetry, or aesthetic value, yet these words also seem inadequate in fully explaining what beauty is. This is the heart of the paradox of analysis. If we already understand a concept intuitively, how can we define it without either restating what we already know or offering a definition that doesn't do justice to the concept's true complexity? B. Circular definitions and their limitations. One common outcome of analysis is the creation of a circular definition, where the definition includes the term being defined as part of the explanation. For example, if we define justice as fairness in the application of laws, we end up defining fairness in terms of justice. Circular definitions don't inform or clarify the concept in any meaningful way, as they depend on the very thing we are attempting to explain. Circular definitions often arise when we assume that we can adequately break down complex, abstract concepts into simple linguistic terms. However, concepts like justice, truth, or beauty are often too broad and multifaceted to be captured by a single definition. By relying on familiar terms to define an abstract concept, we risk falling into semantic circles that do not advance our understanding. 2. The limits of language in conceptual analysis. A. Meaning and intuition. One of the challenges in analyzing concepts like justice or beauty is that their meaning is often intuitive. We know what they mean, but it is difficult to pin down precisely how to describe them. Language, in its effort to define complex ideas, often fails to provide a rigorous or sufficient explanation for these abstract concepts. Take, for example, the concept of truth. We all have a basic understanding of what truth is, yet when we try to define it, we encounter difficulty. Truth is what corresponds to reality. Sounds reasonable, but what does it mean for a statement to correspond to reality? Does a statement have to exactly match reality, or can it be a representation? What if reality is itself subjective or difficult to define? In this case, the concept of truth is not easily pinned down by a rigid definition, and no matter how we analyze it, we seem to be left with more questions than answers. The paradox of analysis thus demonstrates the limitations of language in capturing meaning, particularly when dealing with concepts that are not easily reducible to simpler terms. B. The role of context in meaning context is another crucial element that complicates the analysis of abstract concepts. Words and terms can take on different meanings depending on the cultural, social, and linguistic contexts in which they are used. For instance, what one person understands as freedom might be different from another person's understanding based on historical, political, or personal factors. This variability in interpretation suggests that defining abstract concepts is not just a linguistic problem, but a contextual one. In analyzing concepts like justice or truth, we must account for the fact that their meaning may shift depending on the circumstances in which they are applied. This makes it even more difficult to arrive at a single, precise definition that encompasses all potential meanings or interpretations of the term. The philosophical implications of the paradox. A. Intuition versus formalism. One of the core debates surrounding the paradox of analysis involves the tension between intuition and formalism. Intuition suggests that we already have a pre-existing understanding of concepts like justice or truth, while formalism calls for an attempt to break down these concepts into precise, logical definitions. The paradox highlights the limitations of formalism in capturing the intuitive nature of many concepts, leading some philosophers to question whether we can ever truly formalize such concepts without losing their essential meaning. B. The relationship between language and thought. The paradox of analysis raises important questions about the relationship between language and thought. Is the difficulty in defining concepts a result of language's limitations, or does it reflect deeper issues about the nature of human understanding? If we cannot define certain concepts with clarity, does it imply that these concepts are inherently uncertain or indefinable, or does it simply mean that our linguistic tools are insufficient? 4. Possible solutions to the paradox. A. Redefining analysis. One potential solution to the paradox of analysis is to redefine what we mean by conceptual analysis. Rather than trying to reduce complex concepts to a single definition, we might instead focus on describing their multiple facets and contexts. This approach acknowledges the complexity of the concept and avoids the pitfalls of circularity and oversimplification. For instance, instead of defining justice as simply fairness, we might describe it as a multi-dimensional concept that includes elements of equity, rights, and social responsibility. B. Embracing the limits of language. Another approach is to embrace the limits of language and recognize that some concepts may not be amenable to precise formal definitions. By accepting that certain ideas are best understood intuitively and contextually, we can avoid the frustration of trying to reduce them to a rigid formulaic definition. This solution suggests that language is not always the best tool for capturing the full complexity of certain concepts, and that we may need to rely on experience, context, and intuition to understand them. 5. Conclusion: the paradox of analysis and its implications. The paradox of analysis forces us to confront the limits of language and our ability to define concepts that are already intuitively understood. It highlights the difficulty of breaking down abstract and complex ideas into clear, formal definitions, and calls attention to the importance of context, intuitive understanding, and cultural factors in shaping the way we approach knowledge and meaning. Ultimately, the paradox suggests that analysis and definition are not always the most effective ways of understanding concepts. Sometimes we must accept their inherent complexity and ambiguity. Buridan's bridge paradox. Imagine being asked to cross a bridge, but with a strange condition. The person who controls the bridge only allows you to cross if you make a promise. The twist is this promise is a self-referential statement. You must agree to say something that binds your actions later, but in such a way that your promise can't be fulfilled. This is the Buridan's bridge paradox, a logical puzzle that questions how we interpret promises, statements, and causal relationships. What happens when your own words contradict your actions, creating a paradoxical loop? If you make a promise, but the promise contradicts your ability to fulfill it, how can you ever fulfill it in the first place? The paradox draws us into a world where free will, choices, and self-imposed constraints collide in an irresolvable loop. Let's dive into the Buridan's bridge paradox, where logic, morality, and the consequences of self-section create a knot that challenges our understanding of decision-making and self-consistency. The Buridan's bridge paradox is named after the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, circa 301–358, who proposed a series of paradoxes related to logic, choice, and decision-making. Buridan was a key figure in the development of medieval scholasticism, and is known for his work in philosophy of language and logic. The paradox itself is part of a broader tradition of self-referential paradoxes, those that refer to themselves in such a way that they lead to contradictions or logical loops. Buridan's bridge paradox is closely related to Buridan's ass, another famous logical dilemma involving an ass, donkey, caught between two equally desirable bales of hay. In the bridge version, the paradox takes the form of a logical puzzle where a promise made under a specific condition contradicts the ability to fulfill the promise. It is a classic example of a self-referential dilemma, where the very act of making a promise creates a logical conflict when trying to uphold it. The paradox has been used to explore themes of free will, voluntary action, and logical consistency in both philosophy and logic. The paradox has captured the imagination of philosophers and logicians for centuries as an illustration of how language and choice can become entangled in logical contradictions, ultimately leading to an unresolved situation. It is a perfect example of how self-referential can disrupt our understanding of action and decision-making. The Buridan's bridge paradox is a fascinating exploration of self-referential statements and their consequences in logic and decision-making. The paradox can be framed as follows. A person wishes to cross a bridge, but the bridgekeeper, knowing the traveller will make a promise, demands that they swear an oath before crossing. The paradox lies in the content of the promise itself, which directly impacts the ability to cross the bridge. Let's break down the core elements of the paradox. 1. The setup of the paradox. A. The promise and its contradiction. Imagine that a traveller approaches a bridge and asks the keeper for permission to cross. The keeper agrees on the condition that the traveller makes a promise. The traveller promises, "If you allow me to cross, I will tell you the truth." However, when the traveller begins to cross the bridge, they are confronted with the keeper's next challenge. "Now, tell me, will you keep your promise?" Here lies the paradox. In the Buridan's bridge version, the traveller is bound by their earlier promise to tell the truth, which creates an issue. If the traveller says, "Yes, I will keep my promise," they have committed to upholding the truth, but this puts them in a dilemma about how to proceed. The traveller's choice is tied to an earlier statement, promise, and the paradox unfolds through the contradiction between the promise and the fulfillment of that promise. B. The logical conflict. The dilemma occurs because, in making the promise, the traveler commits to a logical structure that may make it impossible to cross the bridge. If the traveler is bound by a promise to tell the truth, their choice becomes linked to the structure of the promise itself. The paradox can be further explored through the lens of conditional logic. When the traveler makes the promise, the outcome is already dependent on their actions. The promise itself prevents them from making an alternative move, such as attempting to cross the bridge. In a more formal logical framework, this paradox explores how statements about future actions can become paradoxical when the promises made do not align with possible outcomes. By making a promise to tell the truth, the traveler inadvertently traps themselves in a self-referential loop where their future action contradicts their ability to fulfill their promise. 2. Self-reference and logical paradoxes. A. Self-referential statements. At the heart of the Buridan's bridge paradox is the concept of self-referential. Statements that refer to themselves, creating a logical loop. This is what makes the paradox so interesting and perplexing. A classic example of a self-referential statement is the liar paradox, where a statement like, "This sentence is false," creates a contradiction. Similarly, the promise made in the Buridan's bridge scenario is self-referential. The promise to tell the truth depends on the traveler's ability to uphold their promise, but this very promise leads to a logical conflict about how they can proceed. B. The paradox of choice. The paradox also touches on the philosophy of free will and choice. If the traveler is forced to make a promise, is their action really a free choice? This question challenges the relationship between free will and logical constraints. The traveler may desire to cross the bridge, but they are unable to act freely because their promise ties their actions to an earlier statement, creating a situation where they are constrained by the promise itself. The paradox illustrates how constraints on choice, like a promise, can limit personal autonomy, even when the individual wants to act differently. C. The unfulfilled promise. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of contracts and commitments. If the traveler cannot fulfill the promise because the promise itself creates an impasse, then what happens to the integrity of the commitment? It suggests that a promise made in certain contexts, especially where self-exhaustion is involved, can become impossible to fulfill, which may lead to the failure of the promise in the first place. This connects to broader philosophical discussions about the nature of promises, commitment, and contractual obligations. 3. Free will, causality, and the Buridan's bridge paradox. A. The problem of predetermined actions. The Buridan's bridge paradox illustrates a key issue in the philosophy of causality. The traveler is caught between making a promise and fulfilling that promise, but the promise itself seems to make their action predetermined. In a sense, the traveler's future action is already constrained by the promise they made, and the paradox arises because their future action cannot be freely chosen. This is an example of how causality in decision-making can create problems in terms of free will and choice. From a causal perspective, the promise constrains future actions, forcing the traveler to navigate a path where their choices are limited by the very act of making a promise. This tension between free will and determinism is a fundamental part of the paradox. The traveler cannot choose freely because their decision is already bound by the earlier promise, which now sets the conditions for the future. B. Ethical and moral implications. The paradox also has ethical and moral implications. If a person's future choices are constrained by the promises they make, what does that say about moral responsibility? If a person cannot fulfill a promise because it leads to an irresolvable conflict, are they still morally culpable for failing to keep their word? The Buridan's bridge paradox brings to light issues of ethical accountability, particularly when self-referential promises create impossible situations. C. The nature of trust and promise-keeping. In real-world scenarios, the paradox can be used to explore the nature of trust and promise-keeping. If making a promise can lead to an unresolvable conflict, does it undermine the value of promises in relationships, contracts, and social contracts? In the case of Buridan's bridge, the promise itself is the root of the problem, suggesting that some promises may be inherently self-defeating. This raises important questions about how we understand trust, commitment, and obligations in both personal and social contexts. 4. Practical applications and implications. A. Decision-making and logical dilemmas. In a broader sense, The Buridan's bridge paradox is a powerful tool for examining how logical constraints influence decision-making. The paradox challenges us to think about how we make promises, the consequences of those promises, and how they shape future actions. It teaches us that sometimes the very act of committing to a course of action can create conflicts that make it impossible to fulfill those commitments, be applications in law and ethics. In law and ethics, the paradox is a useful thought experiment for considering the limitations of promises and legal obligations. For example, if someone makes a contractual promise, but the fulfillment of that promise leads to an impossible situation, how should the contract be enforced? This dilemma is particularly relevant in contract law, where the ability to fulfill agreements is often contingent on external conditions. Paradox of fiction: imagine a future where time travel is possible. Now, envision a situation where a person travels back in time and causes a chain of events that contradicts their own existence. A paradox that seems to defy the very laws of logic. This is the Polchinski's paradox, a thought experiment proposed by theoretical physicist Joseph Polchinski in 1991. The paradox arises in the realm of time travel and quantum mechanics, particularly when considering how particles or objects could interact with their past selves. In the paradox, a particle is sent back in time to interfere with its own history, leading to a situation where the causal chain breaks down. The question is, how can a particle influence its own past without creating a logical contradiction? The paradox plays with the concept of closed time-like curves, CTCs, where time loops back on itself, creating a causal loop. The Polchinski paradox forces us to reconsider the very nature of causality and time. Can events in the past really be altered without violating the consistency of the timeline? Let's explore the Polchinski paradox, where quantum mechanics, time travel, and causality collide in an intriguing, mind-bending twist. Polchinski's paradox emerged in the early 1990s from the exploration of time travel and its possible implications in quantum mechanics. The paradox is named after theoretical physicist Joseph Polchinski, who introduced it in his 1991 paper titled The Arrow of Time and the Second Law of Thermodynamics. In this paper, Polchinski proposed a thought experiment that involved a closed time-like curve, CTC, a theoretical path in spacetime that loops back on itself, allowing an object to travel back in time and interact with its own history. The paradox arose when Polchinski examined the consequences of sending a particle back in time to interact with its own past. Specifically, he suggested that if the particle were to interfere with its own history, such as by altering its trajectory or causing a collision, it could lead to a logical contradiction. In essence, the particle would create a situation where it could not have existed in the first place, because its interaction with the past would prevent it from traveling back in time. This creates a causal loop which challenges our fundamental understanding of causality and time. Polchinski's paradox was developed within the framework of quantum mechanics, which allows for the existence of closed time-like curves and the possibility of time travel. The paradox challenges the notion that time and causality are always linear, proposing instead that time might be subject to strange, self-consistent loops that break traditional rules of cause and effect. Polchinski's paradox became a crucial element in discussions about time travel, quantum physics, and the nature of causality, particularly in the context of whether time travel is logically possible without creating contradictions in the timeline. The Polchinski paradox is a fascinating and intricate concept in theoretical physics, combining elements of time travel, quantum mechanics, and causality. The paradox illustrates the challenges and potential contradictions that arise when particles or objects interact with their own past in a universe that allows for closed time-like curves, CTCs. To understand the paradox, we must explore the concepts of time travel, causal loops, and the quantum nature of particles. 1. The concept of closed time-like curves, CTCs. A. What are closed time-like curves? Closed time-like curves, CTCs, are hypothetical paths in spacetime that loop back on themselves, allowing an object to return to its own past. The concept of CTCs arises from Einstein's theory of general relativity, which suggests that the fabric of spacetime can be curved by the presence of mass and energy. Under certain conditions, this curvature can create loops in time, where an object can travel back to its own earlier position in the timeline. In theory, CTCs are a possible feature of spacetime geometry, particularly in regions where gravitational fields are extremely strong, such as near rotating black holes, or in the presence of wormholes. The idea of CTCs suggests that time might not be as linear and one-directional as we commonly perceive it. Instead, time could, in certain circumstances, loop back on itself, allowing for the possibility of time travel. However, the existence of CTCs raises profound paradoxes about the nature of causality. The principle that cause must precede effect. The Polchinski paradox is a direct consequence of trying to understand how closed time-like curves might affect the relationship between cause and effect in the context of quantum mechanics. B. Time travel and causal consistency. If an object or particle could travel back in time via a CTC, it could potentially interfere with or alter events in its own past. This leads to the problem of causal consistency. How can a particle interact with its past without creating a contradiction in the timeline? For example, if a time traveler goes back and prevents their own birth or existence, how could they have traveled back in time in the first place? The Polchinski paradox arises when we consider quantum particles within the context of CTCs. If a particle is sent back in time to interact with its own past, it could potentially cause a self-consistent loop in which the particle both exists and does not exist at the same time. This creates a logical contradiction that challenges our understanding of causality and the nature of time. 2. Polchinski's thought experiment, the particle and its own past. A. The particle and the past. Polchinski's paradox centers around the idea of a particle traveling back in time along a closed, time-like curve. In his thought experiment, Polchinski imagines a scenario where a particle is sent back in time to interact with its own past trajectory. The question is, can the particle affect its own past without causing a contradiction? For example, imagine a particle that travels back in time and interferes with its own motion, perhaps by colliding with an object in its past that causes a shift in its trajectory. This would change the particle's path in such a way that it could no longer follow the trajectory that would allow it to travel back in time in the first place. In other words, the particle's very existence in the past would prevent it from ever returning to the future. This creates a causal loop in which the particle's actions in the past both create and prevent its existence. The paradox lies in the fact that the particle cannot both affect its past and exist at the same time. Its influence on the past directly contradicts the possibility of its own future existence. This creates a logical contradiction that undermines the consistency of the timeline. B. The self-consistency principle. To address the Polchinski paradox, some theorists have proposed the self-consistency principle, which states that any time travel event that would lead to a logical contradiction or paradox is simply impossible. In this view, the universe has an inherent mechanism to prevent self-contradictory actions in the timeline. For example, if a time traveler tried to prevent their own birth, the universe would prevent the traveler from taking any actions that would lead to their own non-existence. In this sense, the Polchinski paradox could be seen as a thought experiment that highlights the challenges of causal loops and the potential limitations of time travel in any universe that respects causal consistency. 3. Quantum mechanics and time travel. A. Quantum mechanics and particle behavior. The Polchinski paradox is deeply rooted in quantum mechanics, which describes the behavior of particles on a very small scale. In quantum mechanics, particles do not follow deterministic paths like those in classical physics. Instead, their behavior is described by probability waves and uncertainty. This means that a particle may not have a single definitive position in time and space, but rather exists as a superposition of multiple possibilities until measured. In the context of time travel, quantum mechanics introduces the concept of quantum entanglement, where particles that are entangled share information instantaneously, even if they are separated by vast distances. If particles could travel back in time and interact with their own past selves, this could create quantum paradoxes, where the past and future states of the particle are entangled in a way that defies conventional understanding. B. The role of the observer. Another element of quantum mechanics that plays into the Polchinski paradox is the role of the observer. According to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, a particle's state, position, momentum, etc. is not determined until it is observed or measured. This suggests that time travel to the past could involve the collapse of the particle's wave function, leading to an interaction between the particle and its past state. The paradox then becomes, If the particle's behavior is dependent on observation and measurement, how can the past be altered without contradicting the current reality? Would a time traveler's actions in the past change the course of events, or would the universe have a mechanism to ensure the consistency of history? 4. Possible resolutions to the Polchinski paradox. A. Novikov, self-consistency principle. One possible resolution to the Polchinski paradox is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which posits that the laws of physics prevent any time travel events that would lead to contradictions or paradoxes. According to this principle, if a time traveler attempts to affect their past in a way that would create a logical inconsistency, the universe would prevent them from doing so. This would ensure that causal consistency is preserved and no self-contradictory actions could take place. B. Quantum mechanics and many worlds interpretation. Another potential solution comes from the many worlds interpretation, MW, of quantum mechanics. According to MWI, every quantum event creates a branching of reality, where different outcomes exist in parallel universes. In this framework, the Polchinski paradox could be resolved by suggesting that when a particle travels back in time and interacts with its past, it creates a new timeline or parallel universe. In this way, the causal loop is avoided, and the timeline remains consistent, but multiple realities can exist simultaneously. A consistent histories approach. A third potential resolution comes from the consistent histories approach in quantum mechanics, which attempts to describe quantum systems without relying on the idea of wave function collapse. In this view, the past and future are constrained by probabilistic rules, and a self-consistent history is one that adheres to those rules. The paradox may then be resolved by maintaining consistency in the probabilistic structure of the timeline, preventing contradictory actions. Fitch's paradox. Imagine that you know something to be true, but there's a catch. The very act of knowing it means that you can't know it in a certain way. This is the essence of Fitch's paradox, a fascinating logical conundrum that reveals a surprising limitation in our understanding of knowledge and truth. The paradox suggests that if you know a truth, then there must be some truths that are inherently unknowable, even though we believe we can know everything that is true. The paradox is rooted in the idea that truth and knowledge are not always aligned in the ways we intuitively assume. What if truths exist, but they are beyond our grasp? Not because they are false or out of reach, but because the way we understand knowledge itself creates limitations. Fitch's paradox challenges our classical notions of how we can know and prove things, particularly when it comes to logical truths. Let's explore the Fitch's paradox, where knowledge, truth, and logic collide in a surprising twist that forces us to rethink how we conceptualize what we can and cannot know. Fitch's paradox was first introduced by the logician Frederick Fitch in the 1960s as part of his work on the logic of knowledge. The paradox is a result of modal logic, a branch of logic that deals with possibilities and necessities, such as statements about what could be true versus what must be true. Fitch's goal was to explore the nature of knowledge in relation to truth. In the context of epistemology, Fitch's paradox emerged as an exploration of the relationship between knowing a truth and the knowability of that truth. Fitch's paradoxical result came from considering a true statement that is, in principle, unknowable. According to Fitch, if it is true that you know something, then it logically follows that there must exist statements that are true but cannot be known. This paradox has intrigued philosophers and logicians because it contradicts the traditional view that truths should be accessible to all who possess the necessary knowledge. It raised significant questions in the areas of epistemic logic, modal logic, and philosophy of knowledge. The paradox is particularly important in debates about the limits of knowledge and whether there are truths that cannot be known, even if they are true. Fitch's paradox is now a staple topic in discussions of knowledge, truth, and logical reasoning. Fitch's paradox presents a dilemma about the relationship between truth and knowledge. The paradox reveals a surprising implication of modal logic, specifically that if there are truths in the world, then some of them cannot be known. This paradox has wide-ranging implications for how we understand epistemology, the study of knowledge, and it forces us to reconsider how we define knowledge and truth in logical and philosophical terms. 1. The setup of Fitch's paradox. A. Modal logic and knowledge. At the core of Fitch's paradox is the concept of modal logic, which involves reasoning about necessity and possibility. In modal logic, we deal with statements about what is possible, e.g., it is possible that it will rain tomorrow, and what is necessary, e.g., it is necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4. This type of reasoning is crucial for understanding knowledge because it allows us to make claims about what is known and what can be known. In epistemic logic, which deals with knowledge, we introduce the operator K, meaning it is known that. For example, KP means it is known that P. The key idea in Fitch's paradox is that if KP, it is known that P, then certain truths about the world are inherently knowable. However, Fitch demonstrated that this does not necessarily imply that all truths are knowable. B. The structure of the paradox, Fitch's paradox, works as follows. Suppose there is a set of true propositions, some of which can be known, while others are unknowable. The paradox emerges from the assumption that if a statement is true, then it is also knowable. According to Fitch, this assumption leads to the conclusion that any truth can be expressed as a proposition that is known or a proposition that is unknowable. To illustrate this, consider the following setup. There are propositions that are true but cannot be known. If a proposition is true, then it must be either known or unknowable. If we assume that all truths can be known, this leads to a contradiction, as unknowable truths would not be possible. The paradox thus challenges the idea that all truths are knowable. While we may know some truths, there must also be truths that elude our knowledge, leading to the contradiction at the heart of the paradox. 2. The key insights of Fitch's paradox. A. Knowability versus truth. The primary insight of Fitch's paradox is the distinction between knowing a proposition and the proposition itself being true. The paradox suggests that while a proposition might be true, it does not necessarily follow that it is knowable. This creates a rift between what is truthful and what is knowable, showing that some truths lie beyond our cognitive reach. For example, take a statement such as, "There are infinitely many prime numbers." This is a true statement, but according to Fitch's reasoning, it might not be knowable in an absolute sense. We can understand it conceptually, but there might be truths about the nature of infinity or complex mathematical constructs that remain forever unknowable in a strict sense. B. The impact on epistemology. Fitch's paradox has profound implications for the field of epistemology, which is concerned with the nature, scope, and limits of knowledge. The paradox suggests that knowledge cannot simply be a matter of truth and belief. There is something more subtle and complex at play. Specifically, knowledge is bound by limitations that prevent us from fully grasping every truth, even though all truths might exist. This idea also challenges epistemic foundationalism, which holds that all true beliefs are accessible to the human mind if one is sufficiently rational or informed. According to Fitch, this view is flawed, as there may be truths that are inherently unknowable. C. The knowability principle is one of the core assumptions that Fitch challenges is the knowability principle, which asserts that if a proposition is true, it must be knowable. Fitch's paradox shows that this principle leads to contradictions, suggesting that truth and knowledge are not perfectly aligned. It calls for a rethinking of how knowledge is constructed, moving beyond the idea that all truths are within reach of human cognition. The paradox highlights a critical flaw in assuming that knowledge always correlates with truth. Just because something is true doesn't necessarily mean that it can be known, and this distinction has important consequences for how we approach knowledge in both philosophy and practical life. 3. The implications for logic and truth. A. Logical paradoxes and self-reference. Fitch's paradox has similarities to other well-known logical paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, in which statements about truth lead to contradictions. The paradox is often framed in terms of self-reference. The statement, "This sentence is false," leads to a paradox, because if the sentence is true, then it must be false. But if it is false, then it must be true. In a similar vein, Fitch's paradox creates a paradoxical loop in which truths that are knowable also imply that unknowable truths must exist. It forces us to grapple with the limitations of logic in a world where some truths cannot be fully grasped, even by logical minds. B. The limits of knowledge. Fitch's paradox ultimately suggests that there are limits to human knowledge, especially when we deal with truths that lie beyond our current understanding. In an age of scientific discovery and technological advancement, it's easy to assume that human knowledge is expanding without bound. However, Fitch's paradox reminds us that there are still truths, perhaps in the realm of philosophy, mathematics, or the nature of reality, that will forever elude our comprehension, no matter how advanced our methods of inquiry become. This notion resonates with the idea of epistemic humility, the understanding that, despite our technological and intellectual progress, there may always be limits to what we can know about the universe. Fitch's paradox compels us to reconsider our assumptions about the relationship between truth and knowledge, and to embrace the possibility that not all truths are accessible to human understanding. 4. Possible solutions to Fitch's paradox. A. Revoking the knowability principle. One possible resolution to Fitch's paradox is to revise the knowability principle. If we reject the idea that all truths are knowable, we can accept that some truths are beyond human knowledge, thus resolving the paradox. This would entail abandoning the assumption that knowledge is an absolute extension of truth and acknowledging that some truths may exist solely in the realm of the unknowable. Epistemic closure. Another approach is to propose an epistemic closure principle, which argues that if we know certain facts, we also know the consequences of those facts. This principle, however, faces criticism, as it implies that unknown truths are logically accessible, contradicting the conclusions of Fitch's paradox. 5. Conclusion. Rethinking knowledge and truth. A. Beyond truth, the nature of knowledge. Fitch's paradox forces us to rethink the relationship between truth and knowledge. It challenges the classical view that knowing a truth is synonymous with understanding that truth, and instead suggests that knowledge itself may have intrinsic limitations. Understanding these limits is crucial for how we approach questions in philosophy, science, and mathematics. B. Acknowledging the unknowable. Ultimately, Fitch's paradox teaches us the importance of embracing the unknowable. Some truths may exist, but the human mind may never be able to access them. The paradox highlights the complexity of knowledge, reminding us that not everything true is necessarily within our reach. Paradox of free will. Imagine you are standing at a crossroads, and the decision to go left or right feels like the ultimate expression of your free will. But what if everything, from the very thoughts you're having to the actions you take, was predetermined by a chain of events that started long before you were born? The paradox of free will questions the very nature of human autonomy and choice. Is free will an illusion, shaped by biological impulses, past experiences, and the deterministic laws of nature? Or do we truly have the freedom to choose our actions, independent of any external or internal influences? The paradox lies in reconciling the idea of free will, our belief that we can control our decisions, with the deterministic view that every action is the result of prior causes. Can both coexist? How can we claim to be free if every choice we make is the result of prior causes? The paradox of free will forces us to confront some of the most fundamental questions about human existence. Do we truly control our destiny, or is everything already mapped out by the laws of nature, society, and psychology? Let's delve deeper into the paradox of free will, where autonomy and determinism collide, leaving us questioning our control over our own lives. The paradox of free will has been a central theme in philosophical discussions for centuries. Philosophers have long debated whether humans have the freedom to make choices, or if our actions are determined by prior causes. The paradox is particularly rooted in the tension between two dominant schools of thought, determinism and libertarian free will. Determinism is the belief that all events, including human actions, are caused by previous events and are therefore inevitable. According to this view, the universe operates like a clock, where everything that happens is the result of the prior state of the system. Libertarian free will, on the other hand, asserts that individuals are free to make choices independent of prior causes, granting humans authentic autonomy and moral responsibility for their actions. The paradox of free will emerges when we try to reconcile these two views. If the universe is entirely deterministic, it would seem that every decision we make is just the result of a long chain of prior events. If this is the case, can we truly claim to have free will? On the other hand, if we do have free will, how does it fit into the deterministic universe that science seems to describe? This paradox has been explored by countless philosophers, including Immanuel Kant, Baruch Spinoza, and Jean-Paul Sartre, as well as modern thinkers in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and ethics. The debate continues to shape our understanding of human autonomy, moral responsibility, and the nature of existence. The paradox of free will revolves around the question of whether humans truly have the capacity for independent choice, or whether our actions are merely the product of prior causes, biological, environmental, psychological, or even cosmic. At its core, the paradox asks, can we ever be free if everything we do is shaped by forces beyond our control? 1. Determinism versus free will. A. The deterministic view of the universe. Determinism is the philosophical view that every event or state of affairs is the result of prior events according to natural laws. From this perspective, the future is determined by the past, and every action we take is the inevitable result of the events that preceded it. This view is supported by modern physics, which suggests that everything in the universe, from the motion of particles to the movement of celestial bodies, follows predictable laws. Newtonian mechanics, for example, implies that the state of any system, whether it's the motion of a planet or the thoughts in your mind, is completely determined by its prior state. According to determinism, human actions, thoughts, and feelings are no exception to this rule. They are simply the results of biological processes, genetic inheritance, and environmental influences. Our choices, then, are just the endpoints of causal chains that go back far before we were born, shaped by upbringing, culture, society, and even our genetic makeup. B. The problem of free will. If everything is determined, then how can we claim to make choices? If every action is simply the inevitable result of past causes, then free will, the ability to make independent choices, seems like an illusion. For example, if you choose to go left at the crossroads, was that decision really yours, or was it the result of prior causes such as genes, upbringing, and external influences? Hard determinists argue that there is no true free will. They believe that everything, including human behavior, is ultimately caused by previous events. This view leads to the question of moral responsibility. If we are not truly free to choose our actions, can we be held accountable for them? C. Libertarian free will. In contrast, libertarian free will posits that humans do have the ability to make choices independently of external or prior causes. Proponents of this view argue that, even in a world governed by natural laws, humans have a special kind of autonomy that allows them to make genuine choices. This concept of freedom is often linked to our ability to make moral decisions and be held accountable for them. Without free will, it's hard to see how moral responsibility would make sense. If we are not responsible for our actions, how can we be praised for good choices or blamed for bad ones? Libertarian free will is not easily reconciled with a deterministic universe, though. If everything is determined by prior causes, then how can we choose freely? This contradiction at the heart of the paradox of free will is what makes the issue so perplexing. 2. Compatibilism. Reconciling free will with determinism. A. The compatibilist solution. One way to resolve the paradox of free will is through compatibilism, a position that holds that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. Compatibilists argue that even if the universe is deterministic, humans can still be considered free as long as they are acting according to their own desires and intentions, without external coercion or interference. From a compatibilist perspective, freedom doesn't mean the absence of causality, but rather the ability to act in line with one's own motivations. For example, if you decide to go left at the crossroads because you genuinely prefer that path, you are acting freely, even if your decision is shaped by prior experiences, desires, and preferences. Compatibilism shifts the definition of free will away from absolute autonomy to a more nuanced understanding of volitional control. According to compatibilists, we are free as long as we are able to act on our internal desires without being forced by external constraints, e.g., being coerced or manipulated. B. The role of self-reflection and rationality. Compatibilists often emphasize the role of self-reflection and rationality in human decision-making. Even though our actions are influenced by previous causes, the fact that we can reflect on our choices, weigh options, and exercise self-control allows us to act in ways that are consistent with our goals and values. This self-awareness gives us a sense of agency and control, which is a central component of the compatibilist view of free will. By this logic, freedom is not about being completely independent of causality, but about being free from external coercion and acting in line with personal preferences. This understanding of freedom reconciles the deterministic world with our practical experience of making choices. 3. The neuroscientific perspective. Is free will an illusion? A. The brain and decision-making advances in neuroscience have raised further questions about the nature of free will. Brain imaging studies have shown that decisions are often made by the brain before we consciously become aware of them. In experiments where participants are asked to make spontaneous decisions, brain activity can be detected several seconds before the participant reports making a decision. This raises the question, if our brains are already making decisions for us before we consciously choose, does that mean free will is an illusion? Some scientists argue that the unconscious brain processes are responsible for much of our decision-making, suggesting that what we perceive as free will is merely a conscious rationalization of decisions that have already been made by the brain. This view challenges the idea that we have the ability to control our actions in a meaningful way. B. Determinism in the brain. Despite the compelling evidence from neuroscience, many argue that free will is not entirely negated by the brain's processes. Even if brain activity precedes conscious awareness, it may still be compatible with free will if we understand free will in terms of self-control and rational deliberation. The brain may initiate actions, but our conscious thoughts can still influence and shape these actions through reflection and choice. 4. The paradox of moral responsibility. A. The problem of accountability. The paradox of free will raises profound questions about moral responsibility. If our choices are determined by prior events and factors beyond our control, can we still be held accountable for them? How can we be praised for good decisions or blamed for bad ones if our actions were inevitable? The idea of moral responsibility is deeply tied to the concept of free will. If we are not free to choose our actions, how can we be held accountable for those actions? This is a central issue in ethics and law, where individuals are often judged and punished based on their behavior. B. The impact of determinism on ethics. If determinism is true, some philosophers argue that punishment and reward lose their moral justification. Why punish someone for a crime if they had no control over committing it? Similarly, why reward someone for a virtuous act if it was determined by their circumstances, biology, or environment? This question challenges the concept of justice in society. If our actions are determined, then what does it mean to be just or unjust? Can we hold people morally responsible for actions that were predetermined by factors outside their control? 5. Resolving the paradox. The future of free will. A. The balance between free will and determinism. The paradox of free will remains an open question in both philosophy and science. While determinism and free will may seem incompatible at first glance, the compatibilist view provides a way to reconcile the two. By shifting the definition of freedom from complete autonomy to rational self-determination, we can maintain the experience of agency while accepting the reality of a deterministic universe. B. The importance of self-reflection and agency. Even if our choices are shaped by prior causes, our ability to reflect, deliberate, and choose based on our values gives us a sense of control and moral responsibility. The paradox of free will does not necessarily negate freedom, but rather invites us to think more deeply about the ways in which we make choices and take responsibility for our actions. Goodman's paradox. Imagine you are confronted with a seemingly simple statement. All emeralds are green. You accept this as true based on your observation of emeralds. But what if someone proposes an alternative statement? All emeralds are grue. That is, emeralds are green before a specific time in the future, but turn blue after that time. The grue paradox, as it is sometimes called, forces us to confront a fascinating epistemological dilemma. How do we justify our knowledge of the future based on past observations? How do we distinguish between what we have observed and what we can predict? Goodman's paradox asks why we tend to trust statements like, all emeralds are green, over statements like, all emeralds are grue, even though both statements seem logically consistent based on the same evidence. The paradox challenges our understanding of inductive reasoning and the principles by which we extrapolate knowledge from the past to the future. It forces us to think about how we justify our beliefs and whether certain patterns are more reasonable or credible than others. Let's explore Goodman's paradox, a fundamental puzzle in philosophy of science, where the nature of inductive inference and knowledge are called into question. Goodman's paradox was introduced by philosopher Nelson Goodman in his 1955 work, Fact, Fiction and Forecast. In this work, Goodman explored the problems of inductive reasoning, the process by which we form generalizations based on specific observations. Goodman's main focus was to understand how we come to justify our beliefs about the world, especially when predicting future events. The paradox centers around the concept of inductive inference, or the way we infer general truths from a finite number of observations. Goodman's most famous thought experiment involves the term GRU, which refers to an object that is green before a certain time and blue after that time. Based on past observations, we may have seen many emeralds that are green. From these observations, we might infer that all emeralds are green. However, the GRU hypothesis is equally consistent with the observations, as all emeralds we've seen so far have been GRU, that is, they have been green until a future moment, and we have not yet observed them after that moment. The GRU paradox highlights a dilemma. How do we justify the preference for green over GRU? Why do we consider the statement all emeralds are green to be more credible than all emeralds are GRU, even when both can account for the same observations? Goodman used this paradox to explore the idea that our inductive reasoning is governed by more than just logic. It is influenced by language, habit, and historical context. The paradox remains a major topic in philosophy of science, particularly in discussions of inductive logic and the problem of future predictions. Goodman's paradox, also known as the new riddle of induction, poses a fundamental question about the justification of inductive inferences. Inductive reasoning involves generalizing from a limited set of observations to make predictions about future events. For example, after observing hundreds of emeralds and noting that they are green, we infer that all emeralds are green. However, Goodman's paradox challenges us to ask why we find some generalizations, like all emeralds are green, more justified or reliable than others, like all emeralds are GRU, even though both statements are logically consistent with past observations. This paradox questions the foundation of our inductive logic and the assumptions we make when predicting the future. 1. The nature of inductive inference. A. What is inductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning involves forming general conclusions based on specific observations. For instance, if we observe that every emerald we have seen is green, we might conclude that all emeralds are green. Inductive inferences are not logically certain, unlike deductive reasoning, where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Rather, they provide a degree of probability or expectation. Inductive reasoning is a fundamental part of the scientific method. It allows us to form hypotheses, test them, and make predictions about future events. For example, scientists may observe that all observed swans are white and, based on this observation, hypothesize that all swans are white. However, the truth of the hypothesis is not guaranteed. A black swan might be discovered, which would disprove the hypothesis. But the general principle of inductive reasoning still remains useful for making predictions about unobserved phenomena. Inductive reasoning relies on the idea of uniformity. We assume that the future will resemble the past, and that patterns observed in nature will continue. This is why the statement all emeralds are green is justified by our past observations, because we assume the future emeralds will behave similarly to the emeralds we have already observed. B. Goodman's GRU hypothesis. Goodman introduced the term GRU to highlight a critical issue in inductive reasoning. According to Goodman, something is GRU if it is green before a particular time t and blue after time t. The GRU hypothesis is a counterexample to the typical inductive reasoning process. While we may have observed many green emeralds in the past, we have not observed any emeralds after time t, and thus we cannot be sure that they are not blue after that time. The GRU hypothesis is logically equivalent to the hypothesis that all emeralds are green, because it accounts for the observations we have made about emeralds. However, we naturally reject the GRU hypothesis in favor of the green hypothesis, even though both can explain the same observations. The paradox lies in asking why we find the statement all emeralds are green more justifiable than all emeralds are GRU, despite both being equally supported by the evidence we have so far. 2. The problem of justification. A. The challenge to traditional inductive logic, Goodman's paradox, raises a fundamental question. What makes some inferences more justifiable than others? Both all emeralds are green and all emeralds are GRU make the same predictions based on past observations, so why do we consider one more credible than the other? Traditional inductive logic suggests that generalizations are justified by the regularity of past observations. However, Goodman's paradox exposes a flaw in this logic. It does not explain why some patterns are more trustworthy than others. The paradox suggests that the language we use, the habits we form, and the context in which we make predictions influence our decision to trust one hypothesis over another. Our cultural and psychological predispositions shape the way we view patterns and generalizations. For example, the word green may be linguistically and culturally more familiar to us than grew, leading us to prefer the green hypothesis over the grew hypothesis. B. The need for a better understanding of projectability. Goodman introduces the idea of projectability, the idea that some patterns are more predictive of future events than others. However, the question remains, what makes one pattern more projectable than another? Goodman argues that we need a way to distinguish between hypotheses like all emeralds are green and all emeralds are grew based on more than just their logical consistency with past observations. He suggests that projectability is not just a matter of past observations but requires an additional criterion for justification. 3. Addressing Goodman's paradox, responses and solutions. A. The problem of Hume's problem of induction. Goodman's paradox is related to a much older problem in philosophy, Hume's problem of induction. In his famous work, David Hume questioned the justification of inductive reasoning. While we rely on past observations to predict future events, Hume argued that there is no logical basis for assuming that the future will resemble the past. Hume's skepticism about induction lays the groundwork for Goodman's paradox, which questions why we find some inductive inferences more reasonable than others. Hume's problem points to the fact that inductive reasoning is inherently unjustifiable from a logical standpoint. We use inductive reasoning out of habit and necessity, not because it is logically certain. Goodman's paradox builds on this by highlighting how we make distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable generalizations, even when both are logically possible. B. The new riddle of induction. Goodman's paradox is often referred to as the new riddle of induction because it challenges the idea that inductive reasoning can be justified purely through logic or uniformity of nature. The paradox suggests that the problem is not simply about the mechanism of induction, e.g. how we infer general laws from observations, but about the criteria we use to determine which inferences are valid. One potential response to the paradox is to argue that grew is not as projectable as green because it is not as useful in predicting future observations. Green is a more practical and reliable descriptor of emeralds because it has been a consistent feature of the objects we observe, whereas grew is arbitrary and does not offer the same level of predictive power. 4. Implications of Goodman's paradox for philosophy of science. A. The role of language and conceptual schemes. Goodman's paradox forces us to consider the role of language and conceptual schemes in shaping our understanding of the world. The paradox highlights that the way we label and categorize objects influences our ability to make predictions and inferences. Language is not just a tool for describing the world, it shapes our perceptions and beliefs about reality. For example, we might prefer the term green because it has more cultural significance and practical utility, rather than grew, which is a more abstract concept. B. Inductive logic and scientific progress. In science, we rely heavily on inductive reasoning to form theories, test hypotheses, and make predictions about future events. However, Goodman's paradox shows that we must be aware of the criteria that guide our inductive reasoning. The paradox challenges the idea that science is based on neutral observation and highlights the role of subjectivity and choice in shaping scientific progress. Understanding why certain patterns are more reliable or projectable than others is essential for developing scientific theories and improving our predictive models. 5. Conclusion. The enduring challenge of Goodman's paradox. Goodman's paradox challenges our understanding of inductive reasoning and the justification of generalizations. By introducing the concept of grew, Goodman forces us to confront the complex relationship between evidence, language, and prediction. The paradox shows that inductive reasoning is not as straightforward as simply drawing conclusions from past observations. It involves subjectivity, choice, and conceptual frameworks that influence what we consider reasonable or credible. While Goodman's paradox does not have a simple solution, it serves as a critical reminder of the complexity of human knowledge and the limitations of inductive inference. It pushes us to rethink how we form generalizations and how we justify our beliefs about the world, both in science and in everyday life. Paradox of hedonism. We all strive for happiness, seeking out pleasure and avoiding pain. This is the core of the hedonistic philosophy. But what if chasing pleasure directly could lead us to a paradox? The paradox of hedonism reveals a surprising truth. The more we actively pursue pleasure, the less likely we are to find true happiness. This paradox suggests that obsession with pleasure or the pursuit of constant gratification often leads to disappointment, dissatisfaction, or even a decrease in well-being. But why is it that the very thing we seek, pleasure, can escape us when we focus on it too directly? This contradiction in human nature calls into question our assumptions about happiness and fulfillment. What if the best way to achieve pleasure is by not trying to pursue it at all? Let's explore the paradox of hedonism, where the quest for instant gratification and hedonistic satisfaction might actually hinder our ability to live a fulfilling life, forcing us to rethink the nature of happiness and how we should approach it. The paradox of hedonism has roots in classical philosophical traditions, especially those of the ancient Greeks. Philosophers like Aristippus of Cyrene, who was a leading proponent of hedonism, believed that pleasure was the highest good and the ultimate goal of life. This philosophy advocates for the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain as the path to human flourishing. The idea of pursuing pleasure became a central tenet of hedonistic thought throughout history. However, as philosophy evolved, critics of hedonism, including Epicurus and Immanuel Kant, pointed out the dangers of seeking pleasure for its own sake. They argued that a life focused solely on pleasure might lead to disappointment, emptiness, and even moral decay. In modern times, the paradox of hedonism became more widely discussed, especially as psychological research revealed that the pursuit of constant pleasure can lead to hedonic adaptation, the phenomenon where the more pleasure we experience, the less satisfaction it provides over time. In the 20th century, thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell argued that hedonism could only be achieved if people focused on higher forms of pleasure that contribute to overall life satisfaction rather than temporary indulgence. Thus, the paradox of hedonism presents the idea that pursuing pleasure directly may be counterproductive, leading instead to less pleasure and more unfulfilled desire. The paradox of hedonism presents an intriguing dilemma. Pleasure, which is traditionally viewed as the ultimate goal of life, often eludes those who seek it most directly. This paradox challenges the idea that the pursuit of instant gratification and self-indulgence will necessarily lead to lasting happiness or satisfaction. In fact, this single-minded pursuit of pleasure may actually undermine the very pleasure we desire, creating a cycle of frustration and dissatisfaction. Let's examine the different elements that contribute to the paradox of hedonism. 1. Hedonic adaptation, the diminishing returns of pleasure. A. The concept of hedonic adaptation. 1. Key factor behind the paradox of hedonism is the phenomenon of hedonic adaptation, which refers to the gradual decrease in the emotional impact of pleasurable experiences over time. When we experience a pleasurable event or achieve a desire, the initial joy and satisfaction we feel often diminish the more we repeat the experience. This is sometimes referred to as the hedonic treadmill, where individuals constantly chase new experiences and pleasures, but these pleasures eventually lose their ability to provide lasting happiness. For example, when we first indulge in a luxury like eating a favorite food, we experience intense satisfaction. However, the more we eat that food, the less we enjoy it. Similarly, material possessions, like purchasing a new car or upgrading to a larger home, initially bring excitement, but over time these pleasures fade as we become accustomed to the novelty. Hedonic adaptation suggests that the more we chase pleasure through material or sensory experiences, the less satisfying those experiences will become in the long run. This leads to the paradox of hedonism. Seeking constant pleasure or indulging in immediate gratification may leave us feeling more empty or dissatisfied over time. The pursuit of pleasure might provide temporary relief or enjoyment, but the pleasure itself fades, leaving us craving something new. The pursuit of instant gratification, the paradox of hedonism, also arises when we focus on instant gratification rather than long-term fulfillment. People often seek quick pleasures like eating sugary foods, drinking alcohol, or watching television as a way to cope with stress or boredom. However, these pleasures are short-lived and often lead to negative consequences such as health problems, guilt, or disappointment. The problem with instant gratification is that it rarely satisfies deeper emotional or psychological needs. While it might provide a momentary sense of relief, it doesn't contribute to long-term well-being or a sense of meaning in life. Instead of leading to lasting happiness, instant gratification often leads to a cycle of craving and regret. The paradox being that the more we indulge, the less satisfaction we ultimately experience. 2. The role of desire and unfulfilled longings. A. The nature of desire. The paradox of hedonism is also tied to the nature of desire. Desire is often seen as a driving force behind the pursuit of pleasure. The more we desire something, the harder we strive to obtain it. However, the very act of desiring, whether it's a material object, an experience, or a specific outcome, can create a sense of longing that is never truly fulfilled. As soon as we achieve the goal or satisfy the desire, the pleasure we feel is fleeting, and the desire often shifts to something new. This desire cycle can leave us constantly chasing the next pleasure or achievement, but never feeling truly satisfied. This is why people who live primarily for pleasure often feel unfulfilled, despite achieving many of their goals. The paradox is that the pursuit of desire and pleasure is often what prevents us from experiencing lasting happiness. B. The illusion of fulfillment. Moreover, the constant pursuit of pleasure can create the illusion that once we obtain a certain pleasure or reach a certain milestone, we will finally be content. Yet, even when we achieve these desires, we often find that contentment is short-lived. This is because the desire for pleasure is inherently unquenchable. Each achieved pleasure leads to the next desire. Thus, the paradox is that the pursuit of pleasure never truly leads to the lasting fulfillment we anticipate. For example, people often think that if they had more money, they would finally be happy. However, research consistently shows that income beyond a certain threshold does not lead to greater happiness. As people accumulate wealth, their expectations rise, and they begin to crave more, which in turn leads to less satisfaction. 3. The role of meaning and purpose in happiness. A. Hedonism versus eudaimonia, the good life. While hedonism is concerned with the pursuit of pleasure as the highest good, eudaimonia, a term from Aristotle, focuses on achieving the good life through the pursuit of meaning and purpose. Eudaimonia emphasizes the importance of living in accordance with one's values, virtue, and long-term goals. It suggests that true happiness is not found in the immediate pursuit of pleasure, but in living a life of fulfillment that transcends short-term desires. The paradox of hedonism suggests that focusing on immediate pleasure can actually distract from the pursuit of a meaningful life. People who prioritize instant gratification often neglect the deeper sources of happiness, such as personal growth, relationships, and contribution to society. By focusing too much on short-term pleasure, we might miss out on the long-term satisfaction that comes from pursuing meaningful goals. B. The importance of balance. The solution to the paradox of hedonism lies in finding balance. It's not that pleasure is inherently bad, rather, it's the excessive pursuit of pleasure at the cost of meaningful living that leads to dissatisfaction. Studies in positive psychology suggest that the happiest people are those who focus on both pleasure and purpose, finding joy in both the everyday pleasures and the pursuit of personal goals that align with their values. People who balance pleasure with meaning tend to experience higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction, as their desires are more aligned with their authentic selves and long-term aspirations. This balance between hedonism and eudaimonia allows for true happiness, where pleasure enhances life without overshadowing the deeper aspects of fulfillment. 4. The paradoxical wisdom of acceptance. A. Letting go of the need for control. Finally, the paradox of hedonism suggests that the more we try to control our pleasure and happiness, the more elusive they become. By letting go of the need to control every aspect of our pleasure-seeking behavior, we open ourselves up to more natural and authentic experiences of happiness. Mindfulness, acceptance, and self-compassion all play a role in breaking free from the endless pursuit of fleeting pleasure, allowing us to embrace life in all its complexity. B. The counterintuitive approach. The counterintuitive wisdom of the paradox of hedonism is that acceptance of life's ups and downs, rather than seeking constant pleasure, leads to a deeper sense of contentment and joy. By focusing on balance, purpose, and meaning, we achieve the kind of fulfillment that can sustain long-term happiness, rather than chasing after short-lived pleasures. Liberal paradox. Imagine a society that prides itself on being a liberal democracy, where freedom and equality are held as paramount values. Yet, in this society, the very pursuit of these ideals leads to contradictions and dilemmas that challenge the foundation of its principles. This is the essence of the liberal paradox, a situation where the attempt to create a system that maximizes both freedom and equality leads to an inherent conflict between the two. The paradox suggests that efforts to ensure individuals have the freedom to live as they choose may inadvertently undermine equality for others, and vice versa. For example, policies that promote equality in education or wealth distribution may infringe upon individual freedom by limiting personal choice or opportunity. Similarly, policies that protect individual freedom may exacerbate existing inequalities by allowing more affluent individuals or groups to have disproportionate access to resources. This paradox forces us to ask, can a society truly maximize both freedom and equality, or are they mutually exclusive? Let's explore the liberal paradox, where the pursuit of justice, freedom, and equality leads to tensions that challenge our understanding of what it means to live in a truly just society. The liberal paradox was first articulated by the British philosopher John Rawls in his influential work A Theory of Justice, 1971. Rawls' theory of justice as fairness aimed to reconcile the ideals of liberty and equality within the framework of a liberal democratic society. He argued that a just society should protect individual freedom while also ensuring fairness and equality in the distribution of resources. However, Rawls acknowledged a tension between these two values that he called the liberal paradox. The idea that equality and freedom are not always compatible, and that achieving one often requires sacrificing the other to some degree. The paradox is rooted in the concept of personal autonomy in a liberal society, where individuals are free to make choices about how they live. While this autonomy is essential for freedom, it can lead to inequalities in resources, opportunities, and outcomes. On the other hand, redistributive policies aimed at ensuring equality can restrict individuals' freedom to use their resources as they wish, thereby undermining personal autonomy. This paradox has been a topic of extensive debate in political philosophy, particularly in discussions about social justice, economic distribution, and the role of the state. Since Rawls, the liberal paradox has been explored and expanded upon by many political theorists and philosophers who continue to grapple with the question of how best to balance freedom and equality in a modern society. This paradox remains central to debates over the structure of liberal democracies and the principles that should guide public policy. The liberal paradox is a fundamental tension at the heart of liberal democratic societies, where the ideals of freedom and equality often conflict. While both values are essential to the concept of a just society, achieving them simultaneously can be problematic. In essence, the liberal paradox illustrates that the more we strive to promote individual freedom, the more we risk exacerbating social inequalities, and the more we attempt to enforce equality, the more we risk limiting individual liberty. The paradox stems from several key ideas and challenges that arise when trying to balance these two essential principles. 1. The tension between freedom and equality, the nature of individual freedom. In liberal democracies, individual freedom is typically defined as the right of each person to make their own choices and pursue their own happiness without undue interference from the state or others. This freedom is enshrined in many liberal ideologies, from classical liberalism to modern liberalism, where the autonomy of individuals is seen as a central pillar of justice. However, the paradox arises when we consider that freedom can lead to inequality. In an entirely free market system, for instance, individuals have the freedom to acquire wealth, own property, and engage in commerce. While this may provide opportunities for success, it also leads to disparities in wealth and resources. Those with greater access to capital, education, or social connections can accumulate more wealth, leaving others behind. This economic inequality can perpetuate social divisions, and thus the very freedom that allows individuals to succeed can also lead to inequalities that contradict the liberal commitment to equality. B. The role of equality in a liberal society. Equality, in contrast, is often understood as the principle that all individuals should have equal opportunities, and in many cases, equal outcomes. In the context of economic equality, this might involve policies such as progressive taxation, social welfare, and redistribution of wealth to reduce disparities in income and access to resources. However, efforts to enforce equality can restrict individual freedom. For instance, in a system that seeks to equalize outcomes through redistribution, individuals may be required to surrender a portion of their wealth or income to support the public good. In such cases, individual autonomy is constrained, as people are forced to act in ways that promote social justice, rather than being free to allocate their resources as they choose. This creates a tension between the freedom to control one's wealth and the equality of opportunities and resources in society. 2. The paradox of redistribution and autonomy. A. Redistributive justice and the limits of freedom. Redistributive policies which seek to level the playing field by providing financial assistance to the disadvantaged are often seen as a moral imperative in liberal societies. Social welfare programs, such as universal healthcare, unemployment benefits, and education funding, are designed to promote equality by ensuring that everyone has access to basic needs and opportunities. However, these policies inevitably come at the cost of individual freedom. For example, in a country with a progressive tax system, the government redistributes wealth by taxing higher-income individuals more heavily. While this is done to reduce inequality, it limits the freedom of wealthier individuals to use their money as they see fit. They are compelled by law to contribute to the collective good, even if they would prefer to allocate their resources differently. The liberal paradox emerges when we recognize that the pursuit of equality through redistributive policies can infringe upon the freedom of those who are being taxed. B. The dilemma of socialism and capitalism. The liberal paradox is particularly evident when comparing socialist and capitalist systems. In socialist systems, the state takes an active role in ensuring economic equality, often through extensive social programs, government ownership of resources, and wealth redistribution. While this can reduce inequality, it can also limit economic freedom and individual choice. In contrast, capitalist systems emphasize individual freedom and market-driven economies, where individuals are free to compete, create wealth, and make personal economic decisions. However, this freedom often leads to economic inequality, as those with more resources and advantages can increase their wealth, leaving others behind. The paradox is evident here. Economic freedom fosters inequality, while equality often requires restricting market freedoms to some extent. 3. The role of the state in mediating the paradox. A. The limits of government intervention. One of the key challenges in addressing the liberal paradox is determining the appropriate role of the state in balancing freedom and equality. If the government imposes too many regulations or redistributes too much wealth, it can stifle individual autonomy and economic creativity. On the other hand, if the state does too little to promote equality, it may exacerbate social inequalities and undermine the social contract that holds a democratic society together. The liberal paradox thus raises the question: to what extent should the government intervene in economic affairs to promote equality without infringing on individual freedom? The answer lies in finding a balance, ensuring that everyone has access to basic opportunities, e.g. healthcare, education, housing, while respecting individual liberties and the freedom to make personal choices. B. The role of social and cultural norms beyond formal policies. The liberal paradox is also influenced by social and cultural norms. In many liberal democracies, cultural expectations around community responsibility, compassion, and solidarity help mitigate the tensions between equality and freedom. Social norms may encourage individuals to voluntarily contribute to the public good through charitable actions, volunteering, or community engagement, without the need for heavy state intervention. This can be seen in countries where voluntary redistribution through charity or philanthropy plays a significant role in alleviating inequality, allowing individuals to retain their freedom while also contributing to social equality. 4. The paradox of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. A central tension in liberal thought is the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Equality of opportunity refers to the idea that every individual should have the same chances to succeed, regardless of background, wealth, or other factors. In contrast, equality of outcome seeks to ensure that everyone achieves similar results, typically through wealth redistribution or state intervention. The liberal paradox arises when these two ideals conflict. Equality of opportunity often leads to inequality of outcome, as individuals with more resources or advantages can use them to get ahead. On the other hand, policies aimed at achieving equality of outcome, such as wealth redistribution, can undermine the freedom of individuals to succeed based on their own abilities and choices. The paradox lies in balancing these two concepts. How can a society provide equal opportunities without stifling the freedom to achieve varying outcomes based on individual efforts? Can equality of opportunity truly exist without inequality of outcome? Or is some degree of redistribution necessary? 5. Implications for modern liberal democracies. A. Reconciling freedom and equality. The liberal paradox remains one of the central debates in modern political philosophy. In practice, most liberal democracies try to strike a balance between protecting individual freedom and promoting equality. This balance is constantly shifting based on political, social, and economic forces. Efforts to address the paradox often result in policies that attempt to minimize inequality while maintaining freedom for individuals and markets. B. A vision for the future. The liberal paradox forces us to confront the reality that there are trade-offs between freedom and equality. As societies continue to evolve, the challenge will be finding ways to foster both principles in a way that promotes justice and social stability. Ultimately, the key to addressing the paradox may lie in respecting personal freedoms while also recognizing the need for collective responsibility to address the inequalities that arise from an otherwise free system. Menno's paradox. Imagine being told that you cannot learn what you do not already know. This concept seems paradoxical. How can we learn something if we have no prior knowledge of it? This is the heart of Menno's paradox, a thought-provoking puzzle from ancient philosophy. Menno, a student of Socrates, asks whether it is possible to search for knowledge of something you do not already understand. The paradox states that if you do not know what you are looking for, how can you recognize it when you find it? And if you do know what you're searching for, why search for it at all? The paradox presents a challenge to the very idea of learning, suggesting that without prior knowledge, it is impossible to begin the process of discovery. Yet we clearly do learn new things all the time. So, how do we reconcile this? The Menno's paradox challenges our assumptions about the nature of knowledge and learning, suggesting that the process of acquiring new knowledge might involve more than simple recognition of what is already known. Let's dive into this timeless paradox, where learning, discovery, and ignorance create a perplexing puzzle that philosophers have grappled with for centuries. The Menno's paradox originates from the dialogues of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, specifically from the dialogue Meno, in which Socrates engages in a discussion with Meno about the nature of virtue and how it can be learned. The paradox is introduced by Meno when he asks Socrates how it is possible to search for something that one does not know, as it would seem impossible to even recognize what you are looking for. The paradox itself highlights a fundamental issue in epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief, by questioning the very process of learning. Plato uses the Menno's paradox to set up a Socratic investigation into the nature of knowledge, learning, and recollection. Socrates, as he often does in his dialogues, refutes Menno's paradox by suggesting that knowledge is not something that must be discovered entirely from scratch. Instead, he introduces the concept of recollection, arguing that learning is not the process of acquiring new knowledge, but rather the process of remembering things the soul already knows from past lives. This concept was rooted in Plato's theory of forms, where the soul has inherent knowledge that can be recalled through proper questioning and intellectual inquiry. Menno's paradox has had a lasting influence on philosophical debates about epistemology and the nature of knowledge, prompting questions about how humans acquire new understanding and whether learning can ever truly be independent of prior knowledge. The Menno's paradox presents a serious challenge to our understanding of how we come to know things and how learning occurs. The paradox asks, if we do not know what we are searching for, how can we find it? And if we already know what we are searching for, why search for it in the first place? In other words, how do we acquire knowledge of something entirely unknown to us, and can that process be meaningful? 1. The paradox explained. A. The essence of the paradox, Menno's paradox, can be broken down into two parts. First, there is the search problem. If you do not already know what you are looking for, how can you possibly recognize it when you find it? This suggests that if knowledge is something we must discover, we are in a precarious position, as we are starting from ignorance and cannot search for what we do not know. Second, there is the prior knowledge problem. If you already know the answer to something, then why would you search for it? This seems to make the entire process of searching, in any meaningful sense, redundant. Thus, Menno's paradox presents us with a dilemma. If we know nothing about something, how can we seek knowledge of it? But if we already know something, we do not need to search for it at all. This poses a fundamental challenge to the process of inquiry and raises important questions about the nature of knowledge, the role of prior understanding, and the possibility of learning. B. Socratic response to the paradox. Socrates, the protagonist in Plato's dialogue, responds to Meno's paradox with a method of inquiry designed to resolve the dilemma. Socrates suggests that learning is not about acquiring entirely new knowledge from scratch, but rather about recollecting knowledge the soul already possesses. According to Socrates, the soul is immortal and has lived many lives, acquiring knowledge in each. This knowledge is forgotten upon birth, but can be recalled through proper questioning. In the dialogue, Socrates demonstrates this by asking a young slave boy, who has no formal education, to solve a geometrical problem. Through a series of questions, Socrates leads the boy to realize the correct answer, even though the boy had no prior knowledge of geometry. Socrates interprets this as evidence of the soul's prior knowledge. The boy didn't learn anything new, but rather remembered something that was already within him. This concept of recollection offers a resolution to the paradox, suggesting that learning is not the process of discovering something completely unknown, but of recovering knowledge that has been hidden or forgotten. 2. Implications of the Meno's paradox. A. The nature of knowledge and learning. Meno's paradox raises crucial questions about how we acquire knowledge and the relationship between ignorance and learning. If we accept the Socratic view that knowledge is recalled rather than discovered, it challenges traditional views of epistemology. Rather than seeing learning as a process of acquiring new information from the external world, it redefines learning as the revelation of information that is already within us. This view has important implications for the study of education and cognitive development. It suggests that true learning does not require starting from scratch, but rather involves uncovering and articulating what we already know on a deeper level. This interpretation aligns with certain modern views in psychology and cognitive science, where learning is seen as the process of developing connections between existing knowledge and new experiences, rather than creating knowledge from nothing. B. The paradox and modern philosophy. While Socrates' response to Meno's paradox is grounded in recollection, many philosophers since then have attempted to solve the paradox in different ways. One modern response is to argue that learning is not the process of discovering something entirely new, but of restructuring and reorganizing existing knowledge. In this view, learning is not about finding new facts, but about synthesizing and applying what we already know in new contexts. In empiricism, philosophers like John Locke and David Hume argued that all knowledge comes from sense experience, the information we gain through our senses. According to this view, we don't need prior knowledge to begin learning, because we can build knowledge incrementally through sensory input. While this seems to contradict Meno's paradox, it's important to note that this view still requires us to recognize patterns in the information we encounter, essentially a process of pattern recognition that goes beyond mere sensory experience. On the other hand, rationalist philosophers like René Descartes and Immanuel Kant argue that some knowledge is innate and part of the human mind's natural structure. For instance, Kant believed that certain forms of knowledge, such as concepts of space and time, are inherent to our ability to understand the world. From this perspective, learning is not merely the discovery of external facts, but involves the recognition of these inherent structures, aligning, in some ways, with Socratic ideas of recollection. 3. The role of the Socratic method in learning. A. The power of questioning. Socrates' method of questioning, known as the Socratic method, plays a critical role in resolving Meno's paradox. Socrates believed that knowledge could be uncovered through dialectical questioning rather than through lecture or direct instruction. By asking a series of questions, Socrates guided his interlocutors toward the truth, often revealing what they already knew but had not yet articulated. This method suggests that learning is a process of self-discovery, an ongoing dialogue between the learner and the world around them. It emphasizes active participation and critical thinking as essential components of the learning process. Socratic questioning, therefore, does not merely aim to impart knowledge, but to help the learner recognize and reveal the knowledge that is already embedded within them. B. The importance of inquiry in education. The idea that learning involves the rediscovery or restructuring of prior knowledge is an important consideration for modern education systems. Rather than focusing solely on memorizing new facts or formulas, educators can adopt methods that encourage students to explore, question, and reorganize what they already know in innovative ways. This view aligns with constructivist theories of learning, which suggest that learners actively construct knowledge through experience and problem solving. By focusing on inquiry-based learning and active engagement, the Socratic method offers a way to tackle the challenges posed by Meno's paradox, making the learning process not just about finding new facts, but about reworking and reinterpreting existing knowledge. 4. Meno's paradox in contemporary discussions. A. Philosophical implications. The paradox also has important implications in philosophical discussions about knowledge, belief, and the nature of truth. If knowledge is merely about recollecting what the soul already knows, what role does experience play in shaping our understanding of the world? This raises profound questions about whether we are truly learning new things or simply remembering the knowledge we have always possessed. Additionally, the paradox challenges the empirical assumption that knowledge comes from sensory experiences alone. If we are always searching for something we already know, what does it mean for our understanding of truth and justification in epistemology? B. The paradox in cognitive science. In cognitive science, Meno's paradox has influenced theories about memory and cognition, particularly in the context of implicit vs. explicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge refers to information that we possess unconsciously, like motor skills or language abilities, while explicit knowledge refers to information we can articulate or express consciously. Understanding how we discover or uncover this knowledge, whether through recollection, experience, or construction, remains a central concern in the study of learning and cognition. Mere addition paradox. Imagine a world where you have the power to add more people to the population, but with each addition, the overall happiness of the world doesn't necessarily increase. What if adding a person to the world doesn't improve the total happiness, but only shifts it slightly? This is the mere addition paradox, a challenging concept in population ethics. In a world where we aim to increase well-being and happiness, how should we value the addition of new lives? Is it better to add people to the world, even if they don't experience great happiness? Or should we focus on improving the lives of those who already exist? The paradox forces us to reconsider how we measure the value of a life, the moral importance of procreation, and the ideal population size. As the population increases, we must ask, does more always equal better? Or could the addition of more lives lead to a world where happiness is diluted and no one enjoys a significant increase in well-being? Let's explore the mere addition paradox, where the ethics of population and well-being collide in a thought-provoking and counterintuitive twist. The mere addition paradox emerged in the field of population ethics, a branch of moral philosophy concerned with the ethical implications of actions that affect the size and well-being of a population. The paradox was first articulated by philosopher John Broome in the early 21st century as a response to earlier theories about utilitarianism and the value of future generations. Population ethics deals with the difficult question surrounding how we ought to value the lives of new individuals relative to those who are already alive. It is particularly concerned with the challenge of how we balance the well-being of the current population with the potential happiness of future generations. The mere addition paradox is a specific challenge within this field, as it illustrates the moral complexity of adding people to a population in a way that doesn't necessarily increase total happiness. The paradox presents a dilemma. If we increase the number of people in the world, should we expect the total happiness to increase? The mere addition paradox suggests that while more people might increase overall well-being, adding people who have minimal happiness or even negative happiness could ultimately dilute the average well-being of the entire population. This paradox highlights the tension between two common ethical principles, the desire to maximize happiness and the recognition of the value of individual lives. Over time, the mere addition paradox has sparked significant debate in population ethics and has implications for policy making, particularly in areas related to birth rates, family planning, and resource distribution. The mere addition paradox is a concept in population ethics that explores the ethical implications of adding more individuals to a population, specifically in terms of well-being. The paradox arises from the observation that while adding more people could theoretically increase total happiness, it may not always lead to a net improvement in well-being. This contradiction challenges many assumptions in moral philosophy about how we should evaluate the value of life and population growth. 1. The ethical foundation of the mere addition paradox. A. Utilitarianism and total happiness. The mere addition paradox directly engages with utilitarian principles, which argue that actions should be judged based on their ability to maximize total happiness. In this framework, increasing the population by adding more people should, in theory, increase the total well-being of the world. Utilitarianism values happiness as the ultimate moral good, meaning that the more happiness we can generate, the better. If we add more individuals, each contributing some amount of happiness, the total happiness of the world should increase, right? This idea is intuitive, but falls into difficulty when we consider the implications of the paradox. What if these new lives add only a small amount of happiness, or even negative happiness? B. The repugnant conclusion. One of the primary ideas connected to the mere addition paradox is the repugnant conclusion, a term coined by philosopher Parfit. The repugnant conclusion is the idea that, according to utilitarian logic, it would be better to have a large population of people with marginally positive well-being than a smaller population with high levels of happiness. In simpler terms, a world with billions of people living in conditions that are only slightly better than barely tolerable might be considered morally preferable to a smaller world where everyone is living in luxury and enjoying high levels of well-being. This conclusion feels counterintuitive, as we generally value quality of life over quantity. But from a strict utilitarian standpoint, the sheer number of individuals experiencing even marginal happiness could be seen as better than fewer individuals experiencing extreme happiness. The mere addition paradox is a key issue in reconciling utilitarianism with our intuitions about population ethics. It forces us to confront the problem of how to balance the well-being of future generations with the overall happiness of the current population. 2. The paradox of adding people to the population. A. The value of new lives, the mere addition paradox, brings to light the challenge of valuing new lives. If we add people to the population, do we increase the total well-being of the world, even if each new person contributes only a minimal amount of happiness? This is where the paradox lies. While new individuals may add a small amount of happiness to the population, this doesn't necessarily improve the average well-being. For instance, consider adding a new person who has a marginally positive but minimally happy life. Does their existence add meaningful value to the overall happiness of the world, or does it dilute it by shifting the average happiness downward? According to the mere addition paradox, there is a limit to how many people we can add before the dilution effect overtakes the benefit of the addition. B. The quality of life. One of the central aspects of the paradox is the quality of life of the individuals being added to the population. While utilitarianism focuses on maximizing total happiness, it doesn't always take into account the quality of that happiness. A person with a high-quality life will experience a greater sense of well-being, while someone with a low-quality life may experience only marginal happiness. The problem is that we cannot always predict the quality of life of future generations. If the new additions to the population live in poverty or squalor, their marginal happiness may be so low that it fails to improve total well-being. In this case, the paradox illustrates how more people may not always lead to better outcomes for society. 3. Solving the mere addition paradox. A. The average happiness approach. 1. Solution to the mere addition paradox is to consider the average happiness of the population rather than just the total happiness. This approach acknowledges that adding people who have low levels of happiness will dilute the overall well-being of the population, even if the total happiness increases. In this framework, the goal would be to ensure that the average happiness of the population remains high. For example, adding individuals who experience low-quality life may increase total happiness, but it could reduce the average happiness of society. By focusing on improving the lives of existing individuals, or making sure that new additions have meaningful well-being, society could avoid the negative effects of overpopulation and dilution. B. The prioritarian approach. Another approach to resolving the paradox is to adopt a prioritarian perspective, which holds that we should prioritize improving the lives of those who are worst off in society. According to this view, it is better to focus on improving the quality of life for existing individuals rather than adding new people with uncertain well-being. In this way, we would prevent the dilution of happiness that comes with the addition of people who have marginal or negative well-being. C. The potential of global well-being. The paradox also prompts us to reconsider the global balance between population growth and well-being. As populations increase, governments and organizations must consider whether it is more important to improve the well-being of existing individuals or to allow the population to grow. Strategies focused on sustainable development, equality, and resource allocation can help maintain high average well-being while keeping population growth within manageable levels. 4. Implications for population policies. A. Reproductive ethics. The mere addition paradox has significant implications for population policies, including those related to birth rates, family planning, and immigration. Governments may face difficult ethical questions about the right to procreate and whether society has a duty to control population growth in order to preserve overall well-being. If adding people to the population doesn't necessarily improve total happiness, should society focus on quality over quantity? Policies promoting sustainable population growth and ensuring that the well-being of each new life is prioritized could help alleviate the moral dilemma posed by the paradox. Of the resource management. The paradox also brings to light the issue of resource management. As populations increase, the pressure on natural resources, healthcare, and social services intensifies. To avoid the dilution of happiness and well-being, society must consider sustainable living and ensure that resources are distributed fairly to improve the lives of all individuals, especially those with the lowest quality of life. 5. Conclusion. The mere addition paradox and our moral priorities. A. Rethinking happiness and population. The mere addition paradox forces us to rethink the assumptions about happiness, population growth, and well-being. While more people may increase total happiness, it is crucial to consider whether the quality of life for each individual is being compromised in the process. The paradox challenges our moral priorities, urging us to focus on creating a world where happiness is not just abundant, but meaningful for everyone. B. Sustainable progress. Ultimately, the mere addition paradox suggests that true progress lies not in the number of lives we add, but in the quality of those lives. By focusing on improving the well-being of existing individuals and ensuring that new lives are brought into a world where their happiness is valued, we can avoid the trap of dilution and build a future where happiness is maximized for everyone. Moore's paradox. What if I told you that you could say something that logically doesn't make sense, yet you still believe it? What if you could assert something that you believe is true, but, when examined, reveals a contradiction in your reasoning? This is the core of Moore's paradox, a curious phenomenon in philosophy where assertions about belief and knowledge can create a logical inconsistency. The paradox, famously coined by philosopher G.E. Moore in the early 20th century, involves statements like, "It is raining, but I do not believe that it is raining," or "I know that I am not in pain, but I am in pain." These are self-contradictory because they assert beliefs that seem incompatible with the speaker's own mental state. So how can you assert something that you believe is false? The paradox pushes us to question the nature of belief, knowledge, and assertion, and whether there is a contradiction in holding true beliefs while also asserting false ones. Let's delve deeper into the Moore's paradox, where beliefs and assertions collide in an apparent contradiction that challenges how we understand human reasoning and rationality. Moore's paradox was introduced by the British philosopher G.E. Moore in 1939 in an essay titled A Defense of Common Sense. Moore famously argued that certain types of assertions could create contradictions when examined, particularly statements about what someone believes or knows. The paradox was first discussed in the context of philosophical debates about knowledge and certainty, especially in contrast to skepticism and the Cartesian project of doubting everything that could be doubted. Moore's paradox centers on the idea that one can assert something, such as "it is raining," while also asserting something contradictory about their belief in that same statement. "But I do not believe that it is raining." This raises the question of how a person can simultaneously believe something to be true while also making a contradictory assertion about their belief. Moore used this paradox to challenge the relationship between knowledge, belief, and assertion. While Moore's paradox seems relatively simple, it has had profound implications for philosophical discussions on epistemology and the philosophy of language. Scholars have used the paradox to explore how humans relate to the things they believe to be true and how we assert those beliefs in everyday life. Over time, Moore's paradox has led to broader questions about the role of internal states like belief and knowledge, in shaping external assertions, and how these processes might conflict in everyday reasoning. The Moore's paradox is a striking philosophical puzzle that revolves around the tension between assertion and belief. It exposes the ways in which logical coherence can break down when we think about what we know and believe, especially in relation to what we say or assert. Moore's paradox is exemplified by sentences like, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining. I know that I am not in pain, but I am in pain." These statements seem to be contradictory because they assert something that a person believes is true, while simultaneously asserting that they do not believe it. The paradox prompts us to ask, how can it be that someone holds a belief in something but then asserts the opposite? The paradox is puzzling because it shows that there can be a disconnect between what a person believes and what they say, even though both should theoretically align. 1. Understanding assertion and belief. A. What is an assertion? In philosophy, an assertion is a statement made with the intention of conveying belief or truth. When someone makes an assertion, they are presenting something as true in the world, whether or not they have evidence to support it. For example, when someone says, "It is raining," they are asserting that rain is happening at that moment. Assertions are typically seen as public statements about the world that are open to being tested, verified, or disproven. An important feature of assertions is that they convey commitment to the truth of the proposition. If you assert that something is true, you are typically indicating that you believe it to be true in that moment, even if that belief is not based on evidence or reasoning. Assertions express more than just factual claims. They communicate the speaker's confidence in the truth of the proposition. Belief. What is a belief? Belief is an internal mental state in which an individual holds something to be true. Unlike assertions, which are external statements made to the world, beliefs are internal and don't require public demonstration. A belief can be seen as a commitment to a proposition or idea, but it doesn't always involve a conscious assertion of that idea. For example, if someone believes that it is raining, this belief might simply be a cognitive state they hold internally, without having to declare it aloud. Beliefs can be justified or unjustified, and they can be based on evidence or intuition. In general, a person's beliefs are closely tied to their worldview and guide their understanding of the world around them. C. The disconnect between assertion and belief. Moore's paradox exposes a disconnect between these two elements: what a person believes and what they assert. If someone asserts, "It is raining," we expect them to believe it. But if they follow up with, "But I don't believe it is raining," this creates a logical inconsistency. On the one hand, the person has made a statement that suggests a belief, but on the other hand, they are asserting that they do not hold that belief. The paradox becomes more complicated when you consider statements like, "I know I am not in pain, but I am in pain." Here, the assertion of knowledge contradicts the belief and experience of pain. This paradox arises because knowledge and belief are often thought to be inextricably linked. If you know something, it follows that you believe it. Moore's paradox challenges this connection by presenting an example where knowledge, or assertion, and belief are at odds. 2. The paradox of self-contradiction. The core of Moore's paradox. The core of Moore's paradox lies in the self-contradiction of asserting something that you simultaneously deny believing. If a person says, "It is raining, but I don't believe it is raining," they are making a logical error. The assertion that it is raining should logically imply the belief that it is raining. To claim both simultaneously violates a fundamental principle of logical coherence. The paradox also highlights a pragmatic contradiction. Even though the speaker believes the statement to be true, in this case that it is raining, they are unwilling to publicly commit to that belief. In everyday life, people typically expect that the words they speak will align with their beliefs and knowledge. Moore's paradox challenges this expectation by revealing that assertions can be made, even when there is a disconnect between the speaker's internal belief system and the external act of asserting something as true. B. What makes the paradox logical? Moore's paradox isn't simply about making an incorrect statement. It's about making a logically incoherent statement that seems paradoxical because it violates the principle of consistency. In formal logic, consistency requires that if A is true, then any assertion of A should be supported by the belief in A. If someone asserts A but denies believing in A, this creates an incoherence that doesn't make sense logically or epistemologically. Thus, the paradox is significant because it forces us to question how we reconcile belief and assertion in our thinking. While a false statement may contradict facts, Moore's paradox challenges us to think about how beliefs interact with assertions of truth in everyday reasoning. 3. Philosophical implications of Moore's paradox. A. The impact on epistemology. Moore's paradox has significant implications for epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge and belief. The paradox challenges the traditional view that assertion and belief are intrinsically linked. According to this traditional view, if you assert something, you must believe it. Moore's paradox shows that this connection is not always straightforward, as philosophers have debated whether assertions are necessarily tied to the mental state of belief, or whether they can be disconnected from belief entirely. The paradox suggests that epistemic authority, the capacity to make authoritative statements about truth, does not necessarily require an alignment between internal states of belief and external assertions. B. The role of context in assertion. Moore's paradox also raises questions about the context in which assertions are made. Is it possible to assert something without fully believing it? And what does this tell us about the nature of communication and language? In some cases, people may assert things they don't entirely believe, for reasons like social pressure, irony, or habit. For example, someone might say, "I know it's going to rain tomorrow," even if they're uncertain, simply because it's a common expectation in their culture or social group. In this context, Moore's paradox may not just be a puzzle about logical contradiction, but a reflection of the complexities in how people use language to navigate knowledge and belief in social contexts. C. Challenges in rational thought. Finally, Moore's paradox challenges us to reconsider how we approach rationality. Rational thought typically requires that beliefs align with assertions and that people are internally consistent when making claims about the world. The paradox suggests that rationality may not always be as straightforward as we imagine, especially when people assert things they do not believe, creating cognitive dissonance. 4. Moore's paradox and real-world implications. A. The paradox in everyday life. While Moore's paradox seems like an abstract puzzle, it has real-world implications. People often make statements that don't align with their true beliefs. For example, claiming to be fine when they are not, or saying they are sure about something when they are not confident. This discrepancy between belief and assertion is common in everyday language, and can be seen as a reflection of the social dynamics of communications, of mental health and mental health. In some cases, Moore's paradox may have psychological implications. Cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when holding conflicting beliefs or making contradictory statements, can arise when a person asserts something that they do not fully believe. Over time, such contradictions can create emotional and psychological stress as the individual attempts to reconcile their internal beliefs with their external assertions. Understanding Moore's paradox helps us recognize how this tension plays out in communication and self-perception. Paradox of nihilism. Imagine a world where nothing truly matters, where existence has no inherent meaning and the concept of value is merely a product of human perception. This is the essence of nihilism, a philosophical stance that argues life is devoid of inherent purpose. But here's the paradox. Even though nihilism suggests that everything is ultimately meaningless, humans continue to search for meaning, create value systems, and find purpose in their lives. How can we, as human beings, live as though life has meaning when nihilism tells us it doesn't? The paradox of nihilism highlights the tension between the philosophical belief that nothing has inherent value and the human impulse to seek out meaning, value, and purpose. If nothing matters, why do we still create societies, establish ethical norms, or fight for causes we believe are important? Can we live fulfilling lives if we embrace the notion that all is meaningless? The paradox challenges our very understanding of existence, forcing us to confront the fact that human life and our pursuits might be, in some sense, pointless, yet we still live as if they matter. Let's explore the paradox of nihilism, where the human quest for meaning collides with the belief that nothing has intrinsic significance. The paradox of nihilism has its roots in the ancient philosophical tradition, with its most prominent expression emerging in the 19th and 20th centuries. particularly through thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger. Nihilism, at its core, is the belief that life has no inherent meaning or purpose, and that traditional values, including those of religion, morality, and social norms, are baseless constructs. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead encapsulates the idea that, with the decline of religious belief, objective meaning and universal values also ceased to exist. Nietzsche warned that without a unifying moral framework, humanity would be left to navigate a world of nothingness and chaos, a condition he termed nihilism. For Nietzsche, the challenge was not to dwell in despair, but to overcome nihilism by creating one's own meaning and values through the concept of the Übermensch, or overman. Jean-Paul Sartre and other existentialists further developed the idea of nihilism in the 20th century, focusing on the freedom and responsibility humans face when they realize there is no inherent meaning to life. Sartre argued that, in the absence of divine or universal values, individuals must create their own purpose through authentic choices. Despite its philosophical roots, nihilism presents a paradox. If everything is ultimately meaningless, why do we as individuals and societies continue to create value, purpose, and meaning? The paradox of nihilism thus explores the tension between the belief that nothing matters and the human drive to live as if it does. The paradox of nihilism centers around the contradiction between the belief that life and existence have no intrinsic meaning and the human tendency to create meaning, value, and purpose despite that belief. Nihilism posits that life's inherent lack of meaning undermines everything we do. However, the paradox lies in the fact that humans continue to act as though their lives are significant, that their pursuits are worthwhile, and that their values matter. 1. Understanding nihilism, the absence of inherent meaning. A. The origins of nihilism, at its most fundamental level, asserts that life, existence, and the universe are devoid of any inherent meaning or purpose. The philosophical tradition often traces nihilism back to Friedrich Nietzsche, who examined the consequences of the death of God. Nietzsche's exploration of nihilism centered on the idea that the decline of religion and traditional values in the modern world left humanity without a unifying, transcendent source of meaning. Without a divine creator or moral authority, individuals and societies are left with a void, nothing that can definitively justify their existence or values. For Nietzsche, the death of God didn't just mean the loss of religious belief, but also the collapse of objective moral frameworks, leading to a world where truth and meaning were no longer universally agreed upon. For Nietzsche, nihilism represented the absence of a universal purpose and the collapse of traditional value systems. Yet, he also saw it as a transition, a moment in which individuals could redefine their own values in the face of this emptiness. B. Nihilism and existentialism. The paradox of nihilism was further explored by existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, who built upon Nietzsche's work by focusing on human freedom in a world without inherent meaning. Sartre, for example, argued that humans are condemned to be free and must live in a world without any preordained purpose. This, he believed, leaves individuals with the responsibility to create their own meaning and make authentic choices. Sartre's existentialism confronted nihilism by suggesting that, even though life has no inherent meaning, humans can create meaning through their actions, decisions, and experiences. Sartre referred to this process as existence precedes essence, meaning that a person's essence, or purpose, is not determined by external factors, but created through their choices. While existentialists acknowledged the void that nihilism presents, they saw freedom and responsibility as opportunities to create meaning in a meaningless world. 2. The human impulse to create meaning, fighting against nihilism. A. The drive for purpose and value. The paradox of nihilism arises when we consider how humans, despite the belief that life has no inherent meaning, continue to pursue goals, create values, and find purpose in their lives. Despite the philosophical assertion that nothing matters, human beings act as though their actions, relationships, and goals are deeply meaningful. One explanation for this paradox is that humans have an innate drive for meaning and purpose. Even if nihilism tells us that life is meaningless, we are driven by a psychological and biological imperative to seek meaningful connections and purposeful action. This drive for meaning could be rooted in evolutionary factors. Human survival has always depended on cooperation, goal setting, and the development of values to navigate the world. B. Meaning in social constructs. Another way in which humans combat nihilism is by creating social constructs, systems of meaning and value that help individuals understand their place in the world. Religion, morality, politics, and culture all provide frameworks for individuals to derive meaning from their lives, even if these constructs do not have inherent objective validity. Sociologists like Emil Durkheim have argued that social structures are essential for creating meaning and social cohesion. Humans form communities and societies to give their lives a sense of purpose, even in the absence of universal meaning. In this way, the paradox of nihilism is often mitigated by social frameworks that allow individuals to align with a sense of collective value. C. The role of art and creativity. Another important avenue through which humans create meaning in the face of nihilism is through art, creativity, and expression. Artistic creation allows individuals to manifest their experiences, ideas, and emotions in a way that brings personal meaning and fulfillment. Even though nihilism denies the existence of objective meaning, individuals continue to create art and literature, finding satisfaction in the process of creation itself. In the act of creating art, writing, or engaging in self-expression, people often find a deep sense of purpose that defies the nihilistic view that life has no intrinsic meaning. 3. The limits of nihilism. Can we live fully, embracing meaninglessness? A. Nihilism and depression. One of the major challenges of embracing nihilism fully is its potential to lead to existential despair or depression. For many, the realization that life has no inherent meaning can create a sense of pointlessness and apathy. This has been described as an existential crisis, a period of deep questioning and disillusionment with life. The paradox of nihilism suggests that while nihilism can offer freedom from traditional values and societal expectations, it also presents the potential for profound meaninglessness. Many people find it difficult to reconcile their desire for purpose and value with the belief that nothing truly matters. B. The balance between meaning and meaninglessness. The paradox of nihilism ultimately highlights the tension between meaninglessness and the human desire to create meaning. While nihilism argues that life has no intrinsic significance, humans continue to create their own significance. The challenge lies in finding balance. Can individuals accept the idea that life is inherently meaningless while still finding joy, purpose, and meaning in their everyday lives? The answer may lie in embracing meaning-making without the need for it to be universal or objective. Instead of searching for an external inherent meaning, individuals may find fulfillment by creating personal meaning through relationships, creativity, work, and experience, even if they acknowledge that the universe, in and of itself, has no inherent meaning. 4. Conclusion. The paradox of nihilism and human existence. A. Embracing freedom. The paradox of nihilism forces us to confront the absurdity of existence, our desire for meaning in a universe that offers none. However, the paradox also reveals that humans possess the freedom to create their own meaning, and in this freedom lies the potential for authenticity, creativity, and personal fulfillment. B. A philosophical journey. While nihilism may strip the world of inherent meaning, it also opens the door to personal responsibility and individual freedom. The paradox of nihilism forces us to question what it truly means to live fully in a world that offers no fixed purpose, pushing us to create our own values and define our existence. Omnipotence paradox. Imagine a being who has the ability to do anything at all. There is no task too difficult, no limit to its powers. It can create worlds, raise the dead, and even change the very laws of nature. But what if I told you that even the greatest being of all, one with absolute omnipotence, could face a logical contradiction? Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? The omnipotence paradox challenges our understanding of power by asking if there are inherent limits to omnipotence. If something can do anything, can it do something that defies logic, such as performing impossible tasks? Is true omnipotence not simply about having the power to do anything, but also about the ability to act within the bounds of logical coherence? This paradox forces us to question the very nature of power and infinity, and whether the concept of absolute omnipotence can ever be logically consistent. Let's explore the omnipotence paradox, where the idea of infinite power collides with the boundaries of reason and logic. The omnipotence paradox has its roots in philosophical and theological debates about the nature of God and infinite power. The paradox dates back to at least the Middle Ages. When philosophers and theologians first began grappling with the question of whether it is logically possible for a being to possess absolute power, the power to do anything without limits. One of the most famous discussions of this paradox is found in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who argued that omnipotence does not entail the ability to do things that are logically impossible, such as creating a square circle or a married bachelor. Aquinas and other theologians of his time believed that God's omnipotence is bound by logical coherence. In other words, God cannot do the impossible because logical contradictions are not even meaningful tasks. In modern philosophy, the omnipotence paradox is often discussed in the context of God's nature, especially in relation to the problem of evil and divine omnipotence. Over time, the paradox has been re-examined by many thinkers, especially in the context of philosophical and logical systems. Contemporary philosophers still debate whether infinite power can logically exist without encountering contradictions, or if the very concept of omnipotence is inherently flawed. The omnipotence paradox has persisted as a fundamental philosophical puzzle, questioning whether the idea of absolute power is logically sound or inherently self-contradictory. The omnipotence paradox explores the limits of the concept of omnipotence, which is often attributed to deities or supreme beings. The paradox is rooted in the logical problem that arises when attempting to reconcile the idea of absolute power with the nature of logical consistency. The paradox forces us to examine the implications of a being having unlimited power and whether such a being could ever engage in illogical or impossible actions. Here are the key points that help explain this paradox. 1. The definition of omnipotence. What is omnipotence? Omnipotence is traditionally defined as the ability to do anything, including things that are logically impossible. In religious contexts, it is often attributed to a deity, especially in monotheistic traditions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, where God is said to be all-powerful and capable of doing anything. However, philosophers have long debated whether omnipotence truly means the ability to do anything, or whether it is limited by the constraints of logical coherence. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argue that omnipotence is not the power to perform illogical actions, because logical contradictions are not actions at all. For example, it is not a task to create a square circle or a married bachelor, because these are inherently contradictory concepts. From this perspective, omnipotence means having the power to do anything that is logically possible, not to engage in logical nonsense. B. The concept of logical impossibility. In the context of the omnipotence paradox, the key issue is understanding the difference between logical impossibility and mere difficulty. A logical impossibility refers to things that cannot be done because they violate the principles of logic, such as making a square circle or creating a married bachelor. These tasks are not merely difficult, they are nonsensical. Logical principles like contradiction and consistency mean that these kinds of actions have no real existence or meaning. If omnipotence encompasses all possible actions, it is not clear whether logical contradictions can even be considered actions to be performed. 2. The paradox. Can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? A. The classic formulation of the paradox, the omnipotence paradox, is most often posed in the form of the question, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? On the surface, this seems like a question of infinite power. If the being is truly omnipotent, surely it could create such a rock. But if the being is also omnipotent, it should be able to lift anything, including the rock it created. This creates a logical contradiction. If the being cannot lift the rock, then it is not truly omnipotent. Yet, if it can lift it, then the rock does not meet the conditions of its own creation. This paradox reveals the tension between the ability to do everything and the concept of logical consistency. Can an omnipotent being truly do things that defy logic, or must its power be constrained to what is logically possible? B. The logical solution. Omnipotence and logical consistency. Many philosophers and theologians suggest that the paradox arises from a misunderstanding of omnipotence. The idea of an omnipotent being creating a logically impossible task, like a rock that is both liftable and unliftable, is not an act of power, but rather a contradiction in terms. Just as 2 + 2 cannot equal 5, logical contradictions are not tasks that can be done, and omnipotence is often interpreted as the ability to do everything that is logically coherent. In this view, omnipotence is not the ability to perform the impossible, but the power to do everything that is possible. Thus, the paradox doesn't imply a flaw in the concept of omnipotence. It simply points out that logical contradictions are not meaningful tasks. For example, the question itself, can you create a rock you cannot lift, is incoherent, as it asks about an impossible concept. 3. Omnipotence and free will. A. The question of free will and omnipotence. Another dimension of the omnipotence paradox involves the relationship between omnipotence and free will. If an omnipotent being can do anything, can it also create free agents with the power to choose freely? In the context of theology, this raises questions about whether an omnipotent deity can create beings that have the freedom to act in ways that may contradict the deity's will. For instance, if God is omnipotent, can God create a world in which humans have free will, yet still ensure that all actions fulfill God's divine plan? Does omnipotence imply the ability to control everything, including the choices of free beings? Or is it logically impossible for an omnipotent being to allow free will without surrendering some measure of control? This creates a complex tension between the notions of absolute power and human autonomy. B. The limits of omnipotence in the context of freedom. Some philosophers argue that free will is not a limitation on omnipotence, but a necessary component of it. The ability to give creatures the freedom to choose would still fall under the domain of omnipotence, but it would also create a world where free will is meaningful. In this view, omnipotence does not require that the deity be able to control every detail, but that it has the power to enable free will within a logically coherent framework. 4. Theological and philosophical interpretations. A. Thomas Aquinas. And the limitations of omnipotence. One of the most influential responses to the omnipotence paradox comes from Thomas Aquinas, who argued that omnipotence should not be understood as the power to do logically impossible things. According to Aquinas, omnipotence refers to the ability to do everything that is logically possible, and logical contradictions are not considered tasks at all. For example, the concept of a round square is not a real thing that could be created, it is simply a logical impossibility. B. The problem of evil and omnipotence. Another theological implication of the omnipotence paradox arises in the context of the problem of evil. If an omnipotent being has the ability to do everything, including preventing suffering and evil, why does evil exist? This question often challenges the notion of omnipotence, as it implies that absolute power must also include the ability to prevent suffering, and yet does not. Philosophers and theologians have offered various responses, including the idea that free will allows for the existence of evil, but does not detract from the omnipotence of the deity. 5. The limits of omnipotence and the paradox. A. Reconciliation with logical consistency. The omnipotence paradox ultimately leads us to reconsider our understanding of omnipotence. While omnipotence is traditionally defined as the ability to do anything, it may be more accurate to define it as the ability to do everything that is logically coherent. The paradox highlights the fact that logical contradictions are not tasks to be done, and thus omnipotence does not imply the ability to perform the impossible. Being omnipotence as absolute power within logic, at its core, the paradox invites us to accept that omnipotence is about having the power to do anything within the bounds of reason and logic, not the power to act in ways that are inherently contradictory. The real power of omnipotence lies not in the impossible, but in the boundless possibilities that align with logic and coherence. Polanyi's paradox. How do you know what you know? It's a question that seems simple at first, but Polanyi's paradox brings to light the complexity behind knowledge itself. Imagine being able to perform an intricate task, like playing a musical instrument or solving a complex mathematical problem, without being able to fully explain how you do it. It's like knowing how to ride a bike but being unable to articulate how to balance and pedal simultaneously. The paradox lies in the distinction between explicit knowledge, which can be written down or verbalized, and tacit knowledge, which is learned through experience and practice and is often inexpressible. Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian-British philosopher, first articulated this paradox in the mid-20th century, suggesting that much of our understanding is tacita, something we cannot easily describe or convey, even though it is critical to our actions and expertise. How can something so fundamental to our everyday lives, like intuition or skill, be so hard to explain? Polanyi's paradox forces us to rethink the very nature of knowledge, expertise, and learning. It challenges us to explore the unspoken and implicit aspects of cognition, where knowing how often trumps knowing what. Let's explore the Polanyi's paradox, where tacit knowledge and conscious understanding collide in a complex dance of learning. The Polanyi's paradox is named after Michael Polanyi, a philosopher and scientist who introduced the concept in the 1950s. Born in Hungary, Polanyi was initially trained as a chemist, but became increasingly interested in philosophy and the nature of knowledge. His works, particularly Personal Knowledge, 1958, laid the foundation for the paradox. Polanyi argued that much of what we know is not captured through explicit facts or formal education, but rather through personal experience and practice. His concept of tacit knowledge refers to knowledge that is difficult, if not impossible, to express in words. It is the type of knowledge gained through experience, intuition, and hands-on learning, rather than through formal education or verbal instructions. For example, a skilled surgeon may know how to make precise incisions, but they may struggle to explain how they just know where to cut or how to handle delicate tissues. This knowledge is deeply personal and often tied to sensory experience. Polanyi's paradox lies in the realization that, while we rely heavily on tacit knowledge, it is not easily shared or transferred to others. This creates a challenge in fields like education, science, and even everyday life, where the focus is often placed on explicit knowledge that can be written down, thought, and passed on. Polanyi's work reshaped how we view expertise, learning, and knowledge transmission. The paradox highlights the limitations of formal knowledge structures, suggesting that there is a significant gap between what we can explain and what we know. Polanyi's paradox is fundamentally a paradox about the nature of knowledge and how we acquire, use, and communicate it. The paradox occurs because there is a critical distinction between explicit knowledge, which is codified and easily transmitted through words or formal instruction, and tacit knowledge, which is personal, experiential, and difficult to express. The paradox arises when we recognize that a large portion of what we know cannot be easily articulated, yet is central to our functioning and expertise. The key to understanding Polanyi's paradox is the concept of tacit knowledge, which refers to knowledge that we acquire through experience and personal interaction with the world. This is knowledge that is often embodied in action, intuition, and physical practice, and it is inherently difficult to describe or explain using explicit terms. It is not something that can be easily written down in a manual or transferred through lectures. Instead, tacit knowledge is often demonstrated through action or experience, with the learner gradually absorbing the knowledge without explicit instruction. This paradox has profound implications for education, learning, and expertise in a variety of fields. 1. The nature of tacit knowledge. A. Tacit versus explicit knowledge. Polanyi's paradox rests on the distinction between two types of knowledge, explicit and tacit. Explicit knowledge is that which can be easily codified, written down, and communicated to others. It consists of facts, rules, and concepts that can be shared through books, articles, or lectures. For example, the knowledge of how to perform basic arithmetic or the process of photosynthesis are explicit forms of knowledge. They can be explained, documented, and transferred easily. In contrast, tacit knowledge is non-verbal, experiential, and often intuitive. It is gained through practice, repetition, and embodied experience. This kind of knowledge cannot be easily articulated because it is often implicit in the actions of the person who possesses it. Examples of tacit knowledge include the skills of a craftsman who knows how to work with wood through years of experience, or a seasoned teacher who intuitively knows how to engage students without being able to fully explain their techniques. B. Examples of tacit knowledge. One of the classic examples of tacit knowledge is learning to ride a bicycle. Although we can explain the mechanics of how a bicycle works, how pedaling propels it forward, how the handlebars steer, and how balance is maintained, we cannot easily explain how to balance on a bike while riding. You learn this by doing it, and over time, you acquire the ability to balance without consciously thinking about it. This ability is based on tacit knowledge, which is gained embodied through experience. Similarly, music is often learned through practice and imitation. A musician may be able to read music, explicit knowledge, but the ability to play an instrument with skill, expressiveness, and technique involves tacit knowledge, an understanding of the subtleties of touch, rhythm, and emotion that cannot be easily transferred or written down. C. The role of intuition. Another key aspect of tacit knowledge is intuition, the ability to understand something instinctively, without the need for conscious reasoning. This is a critical component of many expert activities. For example, a highly experienced chess player can sense the best move in a given situation, even without consciously evaluating every possible combination. The player draws upon years of practice and pattern recognition, all of which are forms of tacit knowledge. This intuition cannot be fully explained or codified, but it is central to the success of the expert. Polanyi argued that this intuitive aspect of knowing is an integral part of human experience, particularly when it comes to skilled actions or artistic performance. 2. The tacit knowledge in expertise A. The development of expertise. One of the most intriguing aspects of Polanyi's paradox is the way tacit knowledge is developed through experience and deliberate practice. Expertise in any domain, whether it's sports, medicine, art, or engineering, is built upon layers of tacit knowledge. Experts in any field are often unable to articulate all the knowledge they use in their practice, yet they perform with a level of fluidity, accuracy, and insight that is beyond the reach of novices. For example, a doctor may have a wealth of clinical knowledge, explicit knowledge, but much of the expertise in diagnosing patients comes from tacit knowledge. This includes the ability to pick up on subtle clues in a patient's symptoms, history, and behavior that cannot be fully explained by textbooks or diagnostic tests. The development of expertise through the accumulation of tacit knowledge can also explain why novice learners often struggle to master complex tasks. This is because much of the knowledge required to perform these tasks well is implicit, not something that can be easily explained through instructions. Instead, it must be learned through experience, trial and error, and mentoring. B. The problem of transmission. The paradox arises when we attempt to transmit tacit knowledge to others. Explicit knowledge can be passed easily through written manuals, lectures, and instructions, but tacit knowledge is far more elusive. How do you teach someone to play an instrument, write a novel, or perform surgery without simply handing them a manual? While you can give them the basic instructions, the majority of their learning will come from experience, making mistakes, observing others, and engaging deeply with the craft. Even then, it's unlikely that they will be able to articulate exactly how they develop their skill. This inability to easily transmit tacit knowledge is one of the challenges faced by educators, mentors, and leaders. Despite their expertise, they may struggle to teach others the full depth of their knowledge because so much of it is embodied and personal. 3. The implications of Polanyi's paradox for knowledge A. Rethinking knowledge and teaching. Polanyi's paradox has profound implications for how we understand knowledge and learning. It challenges the conventional view that knowledge is something that can be easily documented, transferred, and shared. Instead, it emphasizes the idea that much of what we know is tacit, learned through experience, personal involvement, and practice. This insight calls into question traditional approaches to education and training, which often focus on explicit knowledge, facts, theories, and data, while neglecting the tacit dimensions of learning. It suggests that experiential learning, hands-on practice, and mentorship are as essential to mastering a skill as the study of formal concepts. B. Innovation and creativity. In fields like art, science, and entrepreneurship, tacit knowledge plays a critical role in creativity and innovation. Many of the world's greatest discoveries and artistic achievements arose from the ability to intuitively understand something beyond what could be explicitly known or documented. This challenges the assumption that all knowledge can be reduced to formulas, data, and explicit instructions. The creative process is often highly tacit, relying on an individual's personal experience, intuition, and the ability to make unconscious connections. Many innovators in technology, science, and art describe their breakthroughs as arising from a feeling or a hunch, something that was not fully articulated but was felt or known instinctively. These insights show how tacit knowledge plays a crucial role in human progress. 4. The intersection of Polanyi's paradox and artificial intelligence. A. Tacit knowledge in AI and machine learning. Polanyi's paradox also raises interesting questions about artificial intelligence and machine learning. While machines can be programmed with vast amounts of explicit knowledge, datasets, algorithms, and rules, how can they acquire tacit knowledge? The paradox challenges the idea that artificial intelligence can ever truly replicate human expertise, because it cannot access or learn tacit knowledge in the same way humans do. AI systems may be able to process explicit knowledge and execute complex tasks, but the human element of tacit understanding, intuition, creativity, and bodily experience remains outside their reach. This raises fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, learning, and consciousness, as AI begins to outperform humans in certain domains, but falls short in others that require embodied experience and intuitive judgment. Preface Paradox. Imagine you are writing a book, and in the preface you openly state that you believe in all the claims in the book, yet you also acknowledge that you could be mistaken in some of them. How is it possible to claim that all the propositions you are making are true, while also conceding that there is a chance that some might be false? This is the heart of the preface paradox, a fascinating contradiction that arises when an author, or anyone making a series of statements, expresses confidence in individual claims, but also recognizes the possibility of error in some of those claims. The paradox challenges our understanding of rational belief and epistemic justification, forcing us to grapple with the tension between certainty and uncertainty. How can we rationally believe in the truth of individual propositions, and yet acknowledge the possibility of falsehood within the whole collection? The preface paradox compels us to reconsider how we reconcile belief in individual facts with the acknowledgement of fallibility. Let's explore the preface paradox, where knowledge and belief come into conflict, raising deep questions about how we justify our certainty in an uncertain world. The preface paradox was first introduced by philosopher David Hume in his work on epistemology. In his writings, Hume discusses the apparent contradiction that arises when someone expresses certainty in each of their individual beliefs, but acknowledges the possibility of error in the collective body of those beliefs. The paradox arises when, for example, an author writes a book and claims that all the propositions within it are true, but in the preface they admit that there could be errors or contradictions somewhere within the text. While Hume raised the issue in relation to general skepticism and the limits of human knowledge, the paradox was formally addressed and explored in more detail by contemporary philosophers in the 20th century. The preface paradox highlights an important tension in epistemology, the study of knowledge, by demonstrating how a rational belief system can lead to conflicting conclusions about certainty and fallibility. In particular, the paradox challenges the principle of closure, which states that if we are justified in believing individual claims, we should also be justified in believing the collective whole of those claims. If we can believe each proposition individually, how can we rationally doubt the entire body of knowledge? The paradox has been the subject of ongoing discussion in both philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, as it illuminates the complexities involved in justifying belief, certainty, and knowledge. The preface paradox exposes the complexity of our belief systems and epistemic justification. It creates a tension between two logical claims. Claim 1. We can be justified in believing each of the propositions in a set of claims. Claim 2. We can also be justified in believing that, as a whole, there may be errors or falsehoods within the entire set of claims. This paradox is particularly relevant in cases where someone, such as a writer, scientist, or scholar, asserts that they believe every individual claim they make, but at the same time acknowledges the possibility that, collectively, their entire body of work could contain errors or inaccuracies. How is it possible to rationally accept both the certainty in individual beliefs and the possibility of global error? 1. The structure of the preface paradox. A. The paradox in practice. Consider an author writing a scientific paper on a subject in which they have expert knowledge. They assert, "I believe all the individual facts and claims I make in this paper are true." However, in the preface, they acknowledge the possibility that errors could have been made, either due to human oversight or the inherent uncertainty in scientific inquiry. The paradox lies in the fact that despite their certainty about each individual claim, they are rationally justified in doubting the whole body of knowledge they've presented. In this case, it is entirely reasonable to accept that while each fact or proposition is likely true, the entire body of knowledge might contain mistakes. In other words, while each individual belief or fact is justified, the person still recognizes that the overall collection of beliefs could be inconsistent or flawed. This creates an apparent contradiction. How can we believe individual propositions with certainty and simultaneously acknowledge that the entire system of beliefs could be false? B. Epistemic justification and closure. The closure principle in epistemology suggests that, If you have sufficient evidence to justify a belief in each of the individual propositions that make up a larger belief system, you should also be justified in believing the whole system. The preface paradox challenges this principle because it presents a case where individual beliefs are justified, but the entire system of beliefs may be subject to uncertainty. For example, an author may believe with high confidence that each chapter of their book presents true information based on research, empirical evidence, and logical reasoning. However, the paradox arises when they admit, in the preface, that errors could have crept into the book. The paradox occurs because their admission seems to contradict the justification of the individual beliefs. If they are justified in believing each fact, how can they acknowledge the possibility of error in the entire work? 2. Theories of belief and certainty. A. Internal versus external justification. One way to resolve the paradox is to explore the difference between internal and external justification. Internal justification refers to personal beliefs that are supported by an individual's own reasons and evidence, while external justification considers the truth of those beliefs from an external perspective, such as external evidence or validation from others. In the case of the preface paradox, the author is internally justified in believing each proposition in their book is true, based on their own research and reasoning. However, they also recognize from an external perspective that the entire body of work could contain errors that they may not have detected. This distinction helps explain why the preface can acknowledge the possibility of errors while still asserting confidence in individual claims. B. Probabilistic reasoning. Another way to interpret the preface paradox is through probabilistic reasoning. Rather than claiming absolute certainty in the truth of each proposition, the author may instead believe that each claim is highly likely to be true. This probabilistic approach allows the author to express confidence in the individual propositions while acknowledging that the entire set of beliefs could still be subject to error. For example, an author may confidently state that 90% of the claims in their book are true, but they also acknowledge that 10% could be incorrect. This would allow them to be justified in believing individual propositions while recognizing that there is still a small probability that some of those claims are false. This reasoning suggests that we can hold justified beliefs about individual facts while acknowledging that the whole system may contain uncertainties. 3. The paradox and rationality. A. The paradox in everyday life. The preface paradox is not just limited to authors and scholars, it appears in everyday situations as well. People make numerous individual judgments based on evidence, but they are also aware that mistakes or misunderstandings can happen. For instance, we might confidently believe that global warming is a scientifically supported phenomenon based on the available evidence. Yet we might also acknowledge that new information could emerge that challenges our understanding. This is a rational belief in individual facts, coupled with an acceptance of uncertainty about the larger picture. This paradox occurs frequently in decision-making processes, where individuals make confident judgments about specific facts, but simultaneously acknowledge the possibility of error in the broader decisions they make. B. Rational acknowledgement of fallibility. The preface paradox highlights the role of fallibility in rational decision-making. By acknowledging the possibility of error, individuals demonstrate an understanding that certainty is often unattainable. This does not imply irrationality, but rather reflects the complexity of human cognition and the acceptance that beliefs are often provisional. Acknowledging fallibility in the preface of a work, for example, may actually reflect a more sophisticated and rational understanding of the uncertainty inherent in knowledge acquisition. 4. Implications of the preface paradox. A. Epistemic humility. The preface paradox promotes a form of epistemic humility, the understanding that, while we may be justified in believing specific facts, we must also acknowledge that our broader beliefs could be subject to error. This humility encourages open-mindedness and ongoing inquiry, as it recognizes that no matter how confident we are in our knowledge, we must remain open to new evidence and alternative perspectives. B. The paradox and our understanding of knowledge. The preface paradox challenges the foundationalist view of knowledge, which holds that beliefs must be justified by an unbroken chain of evidence. It suggests that we can hold justified beliefs about individual facts while simultaneously being aware of the possibility of error in the larger system of knowledge. This perspective helps to reconcile certainty with uncertainty, encouraging a more nuanced understanding of epistemic justification. 5. Conclusion: resolving the paradox. A synthesis of belief and uncertainty, the preface paradox, highlights the complexity of rational belief and justification. It demonstrates that it is possible to be justified in believing individual claims, while acknowledging the possibility of error in the broader system of beliefs. By distinguishing between internal justification, probabilistic reasoning, and epistemic humility, we can reconcile the apparent contradiction and better understand how human beings navigate the complex landscape of knowledge. B. The value of open inquiry. Ultimately, the preface paradox encourages us to embrace both certainty and uncertainty in our quest for knowledge, promoting a balanced approach to belief and inquiry. This paradox invites us to explore the limits of our knowledge while continuing to question, learn, and grow in our understanding of the world. Problem of evil paradox. One of the most enduring and perplexing questions in philosophy and theology is this: why do evil and suffering exist in a world created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God? This is the essence of the problem of evil paradox. On the surface, it seems like an insurmountable contradiction. If God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, then why does he allow evil and suffering to exist? How can a perfectly good God permit the existence of war, injustice, poverty, natural disasters, and suffering, particularly in a world where his power is believed to be limitless? The paradox raises the question: if God has the ability to prevent evil, why doesn't he? And if he has a good reason for allowing evil, how can his nature be described as perfectly good? Over centuries, theologians and philosophers have tried to reconcile this apparent contradiction, offering explanations that range from the free will defense to the soul-making argument and the idea of greater goods. Yet the problem of evil paradox persists, raising profound questions about faith, morality, and the nature of divinity. Let's delve into this timeless paradox, where the existence of evil challenges our understanding of God, divine will, and human suffering. The problem of evil has been a central topic of debate in philosophy, theology, and religious thought for centuries. Its origins can be traced back to ancient philosophers, but it became particularly prominent in Christian theology, starting with thinkers like Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, who grappled with the nature of God and the reality of evil. Augustine's early work emphasized that evil was not a substance or creation in itself, but rather a privatio boni, a privation of good. In this view, evil exists as a corruption or distortion of the good that God created, and it is not a direct creation by God himself. The problem of evil became a major theological issue with the work of philosophers like David Hume and Epicurus. In his essay, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Hume questioned how an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God could allow the suffering and evil that exist in the world. Hume's trilemma, sometimes called the Epicurean paradox, posited 3 possible solutions. Either God is not omnipotent and thus unable to prevent evil, God is not omnibenevolent and therefore indifferent to human suffering, or evil and suffering simply exist without any divine explanation, which contradicts traditional theological views. The problem of evil remains a central subject in philosophical theology and theodicy, the branch of theology that attempts to justify God's goodness in the presence of evil. The paradox has been approached in different ways by figures like Immanuel Kant, John Hick, and more recently William Rowe, each of whom has proposed varying responses to the inherent tension between the existence of evil and the nature of a perfect God. The problem of evil paradox represents one of the most profound challenges to theism and theological belief systems. It questions the compatibility of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God with the reality of evil and suffering in the world. In its simplest form, the paradox asks why a benevolent God would allow evil and suffering to persist in the world, especially when he has the power to prevent it. Over time, philosophers and theologians have proposed various solutions, but the paradox remains a subject of intense discussion and debate. 1. The classical problem of evil. A. The theological foundations of the paradox. At its core, the problem of evil lies in the characteristics ascribed to God in classical theism. Most religious traditions that espouse a belief in God agree on several key attributes. God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-good. These characteristics imply that God is not only capable of preventing evil, but that he also has the moral imperative to do so. The classical formulation of the problem of evil is based on the logical inconsistency between these divine attributes and the reality of evil and suffering in the world. The argument can be framed as follows. If God is omniscient, he knows about every evil act and every instance of suffering. If God is omnipotent, he has the power to stop or prevent these evils and suffering. If God is omnibenevolent, he would want to prevent evil and suffering, as they are inherently contrary to his good nature. Therefore, the presence of evil and suffering in the world seems to create a contradiction in the traditional understanding of God's nature. B. Logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil argues that the existence of any evil at all is logically incompatible with the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. If God is all-powerful and all-good, the argument goes, then there should be no evil in the world. The fact that evil exists challenges the coherence of these attributes. One of the most famous versions of the logical problem of evil is Epicurus's trilemma, which essentially asks, is God willing to prevent evil, but unable? Is he able to prevent evil, but unwilling? Is he both able and willing, but why does evil exist? This trilemma forces the thinker to question the compatibility of divine omnipotence and omnibenevolence with the existence of evil. 2. The free will defense. A free will solution. One of the most well-known responses to the problem of evil is the free will defense, which was prominently developed by Augustine of Hippo and further expanded upon by philosophers such as Alvin Plantinga. The basic idea behind this defense is that evil is a necessary consequence of granting humans free will. According to the free will defense, a good God would allow humans the freedom to make their own choices, even if those choices could lead to evil and suffering. The ability to choose freely is an essential aspect of being human, and it is only through the freedom to choose that people can have a genuine relationship with God. In this view, moral evil, such as human-caused suffering, is the result of individuals misusing their free will. While the free will defense helps explain moral evil, it does not easily account for natural evil, suffering, that is not directly caused by human action, such as earthquakes, disease, and natural disasters. Making theodicy. Another version of the free will defense is the soul-making theodicy, proposed by philosopher John Hick. This argument suggests that the presence of evil and suffering serves as a necessary process for spiritual growth and moral development. In other words, God allows suffering because it offers individuals the opportunity to develop virtues such as courage, compassion, and empathy. These virtues could not exist without the challenges and suffering that come with living in a fallen world. The soul-making defense posits that, without evil and suffering, human beings would never experience the spiritual growth necessary to attain moral perfection or spiritual maturity. Thus, suffering is seen not as an obstacle to faith, but as a necessary condition for humans to become morally perfected in the eyes of God. 3. The evidential problem of evil. A. The evidential problem of evil. While the logical problem of evil focuses on the logical inconsistency of divine omnipotence and the existence of evil, the evidential problem of evil is more concerned with the amount and intensity of evil in the world. The argument is that the sheer amount of unnecessary suffering and gratuitous evil in the world provides strong evidence against the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God. Philosopher William Rowe formulated an argument based on the idea of unnecessary suffering. He contended that there are instances of suffering, such as the death of an innocent child or an animal in great pain, that seem to serve no greater purpose and cannot be justified by any plausible theodicy. These instances of seemingly pointless suffering raise the evidential problem that challenges the traditional theistic explanation. B. The argument from hiddenness. Another challenge to the evidential problem is the argument from the hiddenness of God. Some philosophers argue that the apparent absence of God's direct intervention in the face of suffering, or the lack of clear evidence for God's existence, raises questions about his nature and involvement in the world. The problem of divine hiddenness suggests that, if God truly wanted all people to come to faith and avoid suffering, he could make his presence more evident, thus preventing much of the evil and suffering in the world. 4. The greater good defense. A. The greater good argument. One of the most common responses to the problem of evil is the greater good defense, which posits that evil and suffering exist because they serve a greater, divine purpose that we, as humans, may not fully understand. In this view, God allows evil because it ultimately leads to a greater good, either in the present or the future, that would not be possible without the existence of evil. This argument suggests that free will, moral growth, and the development of virtues such as love, courage, and self-sacrifice are greater goods that can only arise in the context of suffering and evil. The idea is that God allows evil because its presence brings about a higher purpose, even if the specifics of that purpose are beyond human comprehension. B. Criticism of the greater good defense. While the greater good defense has been popular among theologians, it has faced significant criticism. Critics argue that the amount of evil and suffering in the world is so great and so widespread that it is difficult to see how it could lead to a greater good. Furthermore, the argument often assumes that human beings have the necessary perspective to understand God's reasoning, even when the evidence seems to contradict the claim of a benevolent God. 5. Conclusion. The enduring challenge of the problem of evil. A. The paradox of faith. The problem of evil remains one of the most profound challenges to theistic belief systems. While responses such as the free will defense, soul-making theodicy, and greater good argument offer possible explanations, the paradox continues to raise difficult questions about the nature of God, human suffering, and the purpose of evil. For many believers, the problem of evil remains a challenge to their faith, while for others, it leads to a reconciling of their beliefs about God's goodness and the reality of suffering. Ultimately, the problem of evil may not have a fully satisfying answer, and it invites ongoing philosophical and theological exploration into the nature of faith, suffering, and the divine will. Rule-following paradox. Imagine a set of rules that you follow in your everyday life, whether it's for driving, cooking, or playing a game. These rules are often clear and straightforward, providing structure to your actions and decisions. But what if I told you that there's a deep philosophical paradox about following rules? One that challenges the very concept of meaning and interpretation. The rule-following paradox suggests that the act of following a rule is not as simple as it seems. Can we ever truly know if we are following a rule correctly, or are we simply interpreting the rule based on our own understanding? And if our understanding of the rule is subjective, does the rule even have an objective meaning, or does it depend entirely on individual interpretations? This paradox forces us to confront the question, what does it really mean to follow a rule? The rule-following paradox, initially explored by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, challenges our assumptions about language, meaning, and interpretation, suggesting that rules are not as rigid as they may appear, and that their application may depend more on context and social agreement than we realize. Let's dive into this fascinating paradox where rules, interpretation, and understanding collide. The rule-following paradox originates from the later work of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly in his philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein posed a challenge to the way we typically think about rules and meaning. According to traditional views, rules are seen as rigid instructions that guide behavior in a uniform and predictable way. However, Wittgenstein's paradox questions this understanding, arguing that the very act of following a rule involves an element of interpretation that may vary from one person to another, even if the rule appears to be clear. Wittgenstein's paradox stemmed from a fundamental observation. If a rule is supposed to govern action, then how do we know that we are following it correctly? Is it possible to interpret a rule in more than one way? And if so, does this mean that rules are inherently ambiguous? Wittgenstein pointed out that, in reality, we rely on shared social practices and agreement to interpret and apply rules, rather than following a strict set of instructions. The paradox became a central issue in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, especially in discussions about meaning, interpretation, and subjectivity. It questions the assumption that rules can be followed in an absolute, objective sense, suggesting instead that rules are socially constructed and context-dependent. Wittgenstein's work raised important questions about how we understand language and thought, challenging the way rules function both in philosophy and in everyday life. The rule-following paradox is a deep philosophical challenge that complicates our understanding of how we follow rules and how we assign meaning to those rules. It emerged from Ludwig Wittgenstein's later work, where he questioned the idea that rules have a fixed, objective meaning that applies universally. According to Wittgenstein, the very process of following a rule involves interpretation, and this interpretation is context-dependent, influenced by shared practices and social interactions. The paradox suggests that the meaning of a rule is not as clear-cut as we often assume, and that our ability to follow a rule is shaped by our interpretation of it. 1. The nature of rules and meaning. A. Traditional views of rules. Traditionally, rules are seen as objective guidelines that direct behavior in a precise and consistent manner. For example, in a game, the rules specify what moves are allowed and what actions are considered violations. The assumption is that these rules have a fixed meaning, and that there is a right and wrong way to follow them. If you are playing a game, you either follow the rules or you don't. There is supposed to be no room for ambiguity or interpretation. The rules are objective and must be applied consistently. However, Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox challenges this assumption by asking, how do we know that we are following the rules correctly? Even if the rules seem clear in theory, when it comes to actual practice, we often have to interpret them in some way. For example, when we read a rule about what we are allowed to do, we often rely on context and prior knowledge to understand its meaning. Rules in this sense are not as rigid as we think, and may require interpretation based on the circumstances in which they are applied. The role of interpretation. The key insight of the rule-following paradox is that following a rule is not a simple, mechanical process. In order to follow a rule, we must interpret it. This means that in practice, rules are not always as fixed and objective as they seem. They are influenced by the context and the social norms surrounding them. For example, in a game, the rule "you can't step on the line" might be interpreted differently depending on the context, whether it's a formal game with strict rules or a casual game where the line is treated as a suggestion rather than a strict boundary. This interpretation is influenced by shared social practices and mutual understanding. People agree on how to apply rules in a certain context, even if the rules themselves may not be absolutely clear or objective. In fact, many rules are open to multiple interpretations, depending on the perspective of the people involved and the situational context. See rule following and language. Wittgenstein's paradox highlights how our understanding of rules is closely tied to language. Language itself is full of ambiguities, and the meaning of words and phrases often depends on how they are used in context. Similarly, rules are not inherently clear or self-explanatory. Their meaning is shaped by the way they are communicated and interpreted in practice. For example, the word game can refer to a variety of activities with different sets of rules, and the rules for each game can be understood differently depending on the cultural and social context. The meaning of winning in a game can vary depending on the societal context, and even the concept of fair play can have different interpretations. Thus, the meaning of a rule is not static or fixed. It is fluid and shaped by the language we use to describe it and the shared understanding of those who follow it. 2. Wittgenstein's example of following a rule A, the private language argument. Wittgenstein famously explored the private language argument in his later works, where he questioned the idea that individuals could follow rules in isolation without reference to social norms. According to Wittgenstein, there is no such thing as a purely private language, a language that exists solely in the mind of an individual, without any connection to shared practices or social meaning. Wittgenstein illustrated this point using the example of a person trying to follow a rule for addition. Suppose someone is given a rule to add 2 to every number they encounter. How do we know if they are correctly following the rule? Wittgenstein argues that in order to follow the rule, the individual must have some social practice or shared understanding of what it means to add 2. Without this shared context, there is no way to objectively verify whether the rule is being followed correctly. Thus, the act of following a rule requires more than just internal understanding. It requires external validation through shared practices. B. The rule application dilemma. Another classic example Wittgenstein used to highlight the rule-following paradox is the idea of rule application. How do we know that we are correctly applying a rule? Consider a simple rule like add 2 to the number. If we follow this rule, we might end up with results that seem correct at first, but how can we be sure? There is always the possibility that our application of the rule could be misinterpreted, either because of misunderstanding the rule or because of the context in which we apply it. Wittgenstein's paradox suggests that rules are not self-explanatory. They require an interpretive framework to apply. The meaning of a rule is not entirely contained within the text of the rule itself. It is shaped by the social context and the way it is enacted through behavior and communication. This means that rules can never be followed in isolation from the interpretative practices and shared meanings that govern their application. 3. Implications of the rule-following paradox. A. The challenge to objectivity. The rule-following paradox has far-reaching implications for how we think about objectivity in language and meaning. If rules cannot be followed without interpretation, and if their application depends on social practices, this calls into question the objectivity of meaning itself. Are rules truly objective, or are they subjective and dependent on shared agreements? The paradox suggests that meaning is not absolute, rather it is shaped by the social context and collective understanding of those who follow the rule. This challenges traditional views of language and rules as rigid, fixed systems, and instead suggests that meaning is fluid, subject to change depending on the context and the people involved. B. The social nature of rules. One of the major insights of the rule-following paradox is the emphasis on the social nature of rules. Rules cannot exist in isolation. They require a community of people who understand and apply them. This reinforces the idea that meaning is not something that can be privately understood, but is rather something that emerges through social practices and shared norms. In this sense, following a rule is more than just applying a formula. It is a social activity that requires mutual understanding and agreement. Wittgenstein's paradox suggests that the act of following a rule is as much about community and social interaction as it is about the rule itself. 4. Addressing the paradox. A solution to the paradox. While Wittgenstein did not offer a simple resolution to the rule-following paradox, his work invites us to reconsider how we think about rules. Instead of viewing rules as static, fixed entities, we are encouraged to see them as dynamic, socially constructed systems that emerge from shared practices. Meaning is not something inherent in the rules themselves. It is something that arises through the ways in which we use and apply those rules in context. This perspective encourages a more flexible understanding of rules, one that acknowledges the importance of social interaction, communication, and interpretation in shaping how rules are understood and followed. B. The role of context and convention. The solution to the rule-following paradox lies in recognizing that rules are not about strict objectivity, but about context and convention. Meaning arises from the shared conventions that exist between members of a community, and the application of rules depends on the social practices that people use to interpret and enforce them. This view allows for greater flexibility in how we understand and apply rules, while still maintaining a sense of consistency through shared agreement and social norms. When a white horse is not a horse paradox. Imagine you're faced with the statement, a white horse is not a horse. This seems utterly confounding at first, doesn't it? How can a white horse, something that we recognize as a horse, not be a horse? The when a white horse is not a horse paradox forces us to confront the nature of classification and identity. It challenges the very way we categorize and understand the world. Is a white horse still a horse, or does its color somehow alter its fundamental identity? The paradox touches upon linguistic ambiguity and how language and meaning shape our perception of reality. This dilemma is a perfect example of how concepts and categories can sometimes lead to logical confusion when semantic rules are misunderstood or applied inconsistently. What does it mean to say that something is or is not a horse? And when does the distinction of something like color become so critical that it changes the very identity of the object? This paradox invites us to explore the deep relationship between language, perception, and meaning, reminding us that even the simplest of classifications can sometimes be full of philosophical complexities. The when a white horse is not a horse paradox stems from philosophical and linguistic inquiries into how language and categories shape our understanding of the world. The paradox is often used to explore conceptual and semantic issues around classification. Although this specific paradox doesn't have a well-known proponent, it is deeply related to a variety of classic philosophical problems about the limits of language and identity. The paradox aligns with many traditional questions posed by philosophers of language, especially those concerned with reference and meaning. One such example is Wittgenstein's philosophy on the use of words and how language shapes our view of concepts. Language games and the flexibility of meaning are core themes in his work. The paradox is also an extension of classic problems in metaphysics regarding the persistence of identity over time and the role that external attributes, like color, play in changing that identity. Historically, the paradox can be linked to the works of Aristotle, particularly his discussions on substance and accident. Aristotle's exploration of how essential qualities, like being a horse, versus non-essential qualities, like being white, contribute to an object's identity, forms the backbone of the logic that leads to this paradox. The question of whether colour and accident can alter the classification of an object challenges our basic semantic intuitions and is used in modern discussions of conceptual analysis in both philosophy of language and logic. It's not just a quirk of language, but an inquiry into how we structure our very understanding of objects and identity. The "when a white horse is not a horse" paradox presents a logical conundrum by forcing us to question how we categorize objects based on their characteristics, particularly when something as fundamental as identity seems to be at stake. The paradox is tied deeply to philosophical problems of classification, identity theory, and the way in which language shapes our perception of the world. To understand this paradox, we need to explore theories of identity, classification, and meaning, especially as they relate to the philosophy of language. 1. The problem of classification and identity. A. Essential versus accidental properties. The paradox hinges on the essential versus accidental properties of objects. Essential properties are characteristics that define an object's very identity, while accidental properties are those that don't fundamentally alter the object's classification. For example, the color of a horse is often considered an accidental property. It's a characteristic of the horse, but not a defining feature of it. According to this view, a horse is still a horse no matter what color it is. A white horse is still a horse, just as a brown horse or a black horse is. The paradox arises when the distinction between essential and accidental properties becomes blurred. In this case, if someone says, "a white horse is not a horse," they are treating color, an accidental property, as if it were essential to the object's identity, suggesting that the color change makes the object something entirely different. This problem is similar to Aristotle's distinctions in his Metaphysics and Categories, where he notes that a substance, a horse in this case, retains its identity despite changes in its accidental properties, like its color. By treating the color as an essential property, the paradox challenges the notion of identity persistence across accidental changes. B. The role of categories in meaning. One of the main ideas the paradox brings to the forefront is how we categorize things and assign meaning to those categories. When we encounter the statement, "a white horse is not a horse," we are being forced to examine the flexibility and ambiguity of our concepts. The paradox plays on the idea that language can sometimes mislead us into thinking that a horse, once identified by the property of being white, should be viewed as a different object altogether. The problem lies in how we define the category of horse. Does a white horse belong to the same category as a black or brown one? Or are we incorrectly adding qualifying properties to the core identity of a horse, making the color a key criterion of identification? This is part of a larger debate in the philosophy of language, especially in relation to analytic philosophy, about how we define categories and the rules that govern the use of language in classification. Can something be a horse if it doesn't fit our mental model of a horse? And if we modify a feature, like the color, does it suddenly become not a horse? See Wittgenstein's language games. The paradox also bears resemblance to Wittgenstein's work on language games and meaning. Wittgenstein argued that the meaning of words is contextual, shaped by how they are used within specific social practices or language games. If we consider that a horse is defined by its utility in different contexts, riding, working, competing, changing its color doesn't necessarily change the contextual usage of the term. The idea of a white horse and a black horse belongs to the same linguistic game of identifying equine animals in various ways based on their functional roles and properties, including color. When we make the statement that a white horse is not a horse, we are playing a language game where color has been artificially elevated to a defining characteristic of the horse. Wittgenstein might argue that such a use of language is misleading because it doesn't align with the everyday context in which we understand what a horse is. Thus, the paradox stems from misapplication of the term horse in an inappropriate language game, where we confuse accidental properties with defining ones. 2. The metaphysical problem of identity. A. Persistence and change. Another way to understand the paradox is through the lens of metaphysical identity theory. which is concerned with how objects maintain their identity over time and across changes. According to the identity theory, an object must maintain certain essential properties in order to remain the same object over time. In this case, a horse maintains its identity regardless of its color or any other accidental change. Changing the color of the horse does not change its substantial identity as a horse, even though we may use language to create the illusion that color is an essential property of the horse. The paradox challenges the metaphysical idea that objects persist through change. When someone says that a white horse is not a horse, they are essentially denying that the horse's identity can remain constant despite an accidental change like color. This forces us to reconsider how we define identity and how much change can be tolerated before we cease calling something by its original name. B. The problem of overclassification. The paradox also brings attention to the issue of overclassification in philosophical discussions. In philosophy of language, overclassification refers to the act of creating too many categories, or distinguishing things based on overly fine-grained features. In the case of the white horse, by making the color a defining feature of what a horse is, we risk creating unnecessary distinctions that complicate our understanding of the world. Rather than categorizing a horse as simply a horse, we are dividing it into categories like white horse, brown horse, and black horse, potentially overlooking the core identity of what a horse truly is. This overuse of classification and the focus on accidental properties can create paradoxical situations, like the one where we assert that a white horse is not a horse. 3. Logical implications of the paradox. A. Logical formulation of the paradox. In logical terms, the paradox can be formulated as follows. A horse is defined as an animal that belongs to the equine family and has certain characteristics such as hooves, mane and tail. The property of being white is not an essential characteristic of a horse. If we say, a white horse is not a horse, we are suggesting that color overrides the horse's essential equine characteristics, which is logically contradictory. This formulation creates a logical problem because it demands that we treat color as an essential property, which contradicts the basic rules of logical classification. According to standard logical systems, classification should be based on necessary and sufficient conditions, where color is not a necessary condition for identifying a horse. Thus, the paradox highlights a flaw in how we apply logical rules to conceptual categories. B. Paradox as a language puzzle. The when a white horse is not a horse paradox is ultimately a puzzle about how language works and how we categorize the world around us. It invites us to think critically about how we use language to define concepts and the assumptions we make about what constitutes identity and classification. It shows how semantics can be distorted when we try to define something too narrowly or rigidly. Simsum paradox. Imagine a force so immense, so powerful, that it created everything in existence, yet simultaneously it had to withdraw in order to allow creation to unfold. The Simsum paradox centers around this tension. How can God, in the Jewish mystical tradition, both create the world and simultaneously withdraw to allow for it to exist? The concept of tzimtzum, introduced by the Kabbalistic philosopher Isaac Luria, posits that in the process of creation, God had to contract or withdraw his infinite light to make room for the finite world. But this leads to a profound contradiction. How can a being that is omnipresent and all-powerful also create a universe where absence is necessary for its existence? How does God's withdrawal fit within a worldview that sees God's presence as the source of everything? The Tzimtzum paradox raises questions about the relationship between divine infinity and finite creation, where absence and presence seem to collide in a cosmic puzzle that challenges our understanding of the divine and existence itself. Let's explore the Tzimtzum paradox, where divine withdrawal and creative presence intertwine in a thought-provoking mystery of existence. The Tzimtzum paradox arises from the teachings of the Lurianic Kabbalah, developed by Isaac Luria in the 16th century. Luria's work revolutionized Jewish mystical thought and reshaped the way scholars understood the process of creation. Central to Lurianic Kabbalah is the idea of tzimtzum, or divine contraction, which suggests that in order to make room for the created world, God had to withdraw his infinite light, leaving space for the creation of finite existence. According to Luria, the infinite light of God initially filled all of existence. However, in order for the world to exist and have free will, God had to contract or withdraw some of that light, creating a void, or space where creation could take place. This allowed for the emergence of the physical universe, in which finite beings could exist independently of the divine light. This concept of divine withdrawal raises significant theological and philosophical questions, especially in relation to God's omnipresence and omnipotence. How can an all-powerful God both create the world and withdraw from it? What does this mean for the presence of God in the world after creation? The Tsimtsum paradox has been the subject of much debate and analysis among philosophers, theologians, and mystics for centuries, as it presents a deep paradox about divine creation and the relationship between God and the world. It challenges our understanding of divine presence and absence and continues to be a central theme in Jewish mysticism. The Tsimtsum paradox is a philosophical and theological conundrum that arises from the Kabbalistic teaching of Isaac Luria, specifically his notion of Tzimtzum, or divine contraction. According to Lurianic Kabbalah, creation began with the infinite light of God, filling all of existence. However, in order for a finite world to emerge, God had to perform an act of withdrawal. The divine light contracted and created a space within which creation could unfold. This act of withdrawal raises profound questions about how God can simultaneously be present in the world and yet have created it through divine absence. The paradox is centered around the relationship between God's infinity and the finite world. Here are the key concepts that contribute to this paradox. 1. The concept of Tzimtzum, divine withdrawal. A. Divine infinity in creation. In Lurianic Kabbalah, God's infinite light, known as the or Ein Sof, fills all of existence with no distinction between God and creation. However, for the finite world to exist, there must be some sort of separation between the divine and the created. The paradox of Tzimtzum arises because if God is infinite and omniscient, how can God withdraw any part of himself without creating a contradiction? The idea that the infinite light of God contracted in order to create space for the world raises profound questions about the nature of God's presence and absence. God's withdrawal is not just a physical contraction, but a spiritual and metaphysical one, allowing for the emergence of existence that is not entirely dependent on the divine light. This withdrawal creates the space necessary for the world to exist, but it also seems to create an apparent absence of God in the very space where the world exists. The Tzimtzum paradox arises from the question of how an all-encompassing infinite God can withdraw from the created world yet still maintain divine presence within it. B. The creation of a void. Luria's concept of Tzimtzum also posits that the withdrawal of divine light creates a void or empty space within the universe. This void is not simply empty in the conventional sense, but is saturated with divine potential. The world exists within this space, yet the space itself is still inherently connected to God's infinite light. In this paradoxical state, the void is not entirely separate from God's presence, yet at the same time, it allows for the creation of independent existence. This raises the question: if God withdraws to create the void, does this mean that absence plays a fundamental role in creation? How can a space defined by divine absence still be infused with the divine light that originated it? The void created by Tzimtzum must be understood as a place where God's withdrawal creates the potential for independent existence. But it also seems to contradict the idea that God is omnipresent and always present. 2. The paradox of divine presence and absence. A. Omnipresence versus withdrawal. One of the central paradoxes of Tzimtzum is the tension between God's omnipresence and the need for God to withdraw to make room for creation. If God is omnipresent and infinite, how can God withdraw any part of himself without contradicting the idea that God is always present in all places and at all times? The Tzimtzum paradox challenges our understanding of divine transcendence and immanence, two central ideas in theology. Omnipresence implies that God is everywhere and in everything, while withdrawal seems to imply that God is absent in the very space where creation exists. The paradox is heightened by the fact that God's withdrawal is not a physical absence, but a metaphysical and spiritual withdrawal that still allows for the presence of God in the world. God's withdrawal makes room for creation, but this act also leads to the question: how can absence create space for a divinely imbued universe? B. The role of free will. Another aspect of the paradox is the role of free will in creation. The space created by Tsmitsum is what allows for the independence of the created world. Without the withdrawal of divine light, the world would be entirely dependent on God's will, leaving no room for freedom or autonomy. Tsmitsum thus makes possible free will, allowing created beings to act in ways that are independent of divine coercion. Yet the paradox arises because the very freedom created by the divine withdrawal is still ultimately rooted in the divine light that remains present in the void. This raises questions about the nature of free will within the context of divine presence. If the void created by Tsmitsum still contains God's light and energy, how independent can creation truly be? Is free will authentic if it exists within the realm of divine influence, even if that influence is indirect? 3. Theological implications of the Tsmitsum paradox. A. Creation and divine perfection. The Tsmitsum paradox invites reflection on the nature of divine perfection. If God's light must contract in order to create a space for the world, does this imply that the divine must somehow limit itself in order to allow for creation? How can an infinite perfect God need to perform such a self-limiting act? This paradox touches upon the mystery of how God, in its perfection, can create a world that involves absence, imperfection, and limitation. B. God's relationship with the world. The paradox also speaks to the relationship between God and the world. How does God relate to creation after the act of Tsmitsum? If God's light is contracted, but not entirely absent, then how can we understand the immanence of God within the world? The paradox suggests that God's presence may be hidden within the world, not in a direct or overwhelming way, but through the subtle and indirect influence that continues to shape creation. 4. The continuing influence of the Tsmitsum paradox in Jewish mysticism. A. Kabbalistic reflection. The Tsmitsum paradox continues to be an important theme in Jewish mysticism, especially within the context of Kabbalistic teachings. Many Kabbalists have pondered how God's withdrawal could be reconciled with the idea that God is simultaneously both transcendent and immanent. Some have suggested that the Tsmitsum does not mean absolute absence, but rather the concealment of divine presence. God's light is still present, but it is hidden, allowing the world to exist independently while still being sustained by God's energy. B. Philosophical and theological debate. The Tsmitsum paradox also continues to spark philosophical debates about divine free will, the nature of creation, and the relationship between the divine and the world. How does the divine withdrawal affect the autonomy of the created world? And can the world truly be free if its existence depends on God's ongoing presence, even in a hidden form?